Hello, my dear sleepy listener. Welcome to Sleepy Crown, where history's quiet tales gently carry you into dreamland. Tonight, we embark on a complete journey through the remarkable life of Edward III of England, the warrior king who embodied medieval greatness, yet ignited a century of devastating war. This king restored England's honour after his father's humiliating reign, won legendary victories at Crécy and Poitiers, founded the Order of the Garter, and modernised royal government. Yet his claim to the French crown would drag both nations into the endless 100 Years' War, while his later years descended from glory into decline and corruption. Before you drift away into peaceful sleep, I'd love to hear from you wonderful listeners. Please take a moment to like this video if these historical tales bring you comfort. And don't be shy about leaving a gentle comment sharing which medieval king or queen you'd like to hear about next. Your suggestions truly guide our sleepy journeys through history. And if you're new to our peaceful corner of history, please consider subscribing to join our growing family of dreamers who find solace in the past. So cozy up under your blanket, close your eyes, and let the gentle whispers of the 14th century England carry you softly toward restful sleep. If you're new here, welcome to the Sleepy Crown family. Edward, later known as King Edward III, first drew breath at Windsor Castle on a cold November morning in 1312. Entering a world shrouded in political turmoil and dynastic uncertainty, the infant prince arrived on the 13th day of November, born to a kingdom already fracturing under the weight of his father's failures. Contemporary chroniclers would later describe his birth with prophetic language, calling him the boar that would come out of Windsor, a reference that seemed to foretell the fierce warrior he would become. His father, Edward II, had inherited a proud throne from the great Edward I, known as Longshanks, the Hammer of the Scots. Yet, where the grandfather had been a lion, the father proved to be something far more fragile. Edward II's reign had already begun its descent into chaos by the time his son arrived. The king's controversial relationships with male favourites, particularly the Gascon knight Piers Gaveston, had alienated the English nobility and created a climate of suspicion and rebellion that would define young Edward's earliest years. The infant prince's mother, Isabella of France, possessed the fierce blood of the Capetian dynasty. Known to history as the she-wolf of France, Isabella was the daughter of Philip IV, called Philip the Fair, one of the most formidable monarchs of his age. Through her veins flowed the royal heritage of St. Louis and the warrior tradition of French kingship. Yet even as she held her newborn son, Isabella must have gazed upon her weak husband with growing contempt, watching as he squandered the magnificent inheritance left by his father. Windsor Castle itself, where Edward entered the world, stood as a symbol of royal power and Norman strength. Built by William the Conqueror on a chalk cliff overlooking the Thames, the fortress had served as a royal residence for over 2 centuries. Its massive walls and towers spoke of permanence and authority, yet the political foundation of Edward II's reign was far less stable than the stones of his ancestral home. The England into which Prince Edward was born was a realm in crisis. His father's military failures in Scotland had shattered the aura of English invincibility, carefully constructed by Edward I. The disastrous defeat at Loudon Hill in 1307, followed by a series of humiliating reverses, had allowed Robert the Bruce to consolidate his hold on the Scottish crown. English armies that had once struck fear into Welsh princes and Scottish kings now struggled to maintain even a foothold north of the border. More troubling still was the growing discord between the crown and the nobility. Edward II's reliance on favourites like Gaveston had created deep resentment among the great baronial families who expected to serve as the king's natural advisors. These men descendants of the Norman conquerors who had carved England from Saxon hands, saw their ancient rights and privileges threatened by upstart foreigners who whispered poison in the royal ear. Young Edward's earliest years unfolded against this backdrop of political instability. His childhood was spent in the shadow of his father's growing unpopularity, watching as royal authority crumbled and baronial opposition hardened into open rebellion. The ordinances of 1311, imposed upon Edward II by his barons, had attempted to limit royal power and restore traditional forms of government, but the king's stubborn refusal to abandon his favourites made lasting peace impossible. The infant prince was formally created Earl of Chester at 12 days old, following the custom that designated the heir apparent with this ancient title. By January 1313, he had been provided with his own household, complete with nurses, servants, and guardians befitting his station. Yet even these early arrangements carried political significance, as the king's choice of household officers reflected the ongoing factional struggles that divided the court. One of the most significant influences on young Edward's intellectual development was Richard de Bury, Bishop of Durham, who served as his tutor and would remain a close advisor throughout his life. De Bury was one of the great bibliophiles of his age, a man whose love of learning and books helped shape the future king's mind. Under de Bury's guidance, Edward learned to read and write not only in his native tongue, but also in French and Latin, the languages of diplomacy, law, and learning. The educational program designed for the prince reflected the expectations placed upon medieval royalty. He studied the military treatises of Vegetius, learning the theoretical foundations of warfare that he would later apply with such devastating effect on the battlefields of France. He read The Mirror for Princes, the classical guide to royal conduct that had instructed generations of European monarchs. Religious texts and psalters provided moral instruction, while chronicles and histories offered examples of good and bad kingship, drawn from the experiences of his predecessors. Yet perhaps the most valuable education young Edward received came not from books, but from bitter experience. He witnessed firsthand the consequences of weak kingship, as his father's reign spiraled ever deeper into chaos. The murder of Piers Gaveston in 1312, the same year as Edward's birth, demonstrated the lengths to which desperate nobles might go when they believed their legitimate grievances were ignored. The brutal execution of this royal favourite, seized by his enemies and killed like a common criminal, must have left a profound impression on those who witnessed the collapse of royal protection. As Edward grew from infant to child, the political situation continued to deteriorate. His father's new favourites, Hugh Despencer the Elder, and his son, Hugh Despencer the Younger, proved even more grasping and unpopular than Gaveston had been. The Despensers' manipulation of royal power for their own enrichment created fresh waves of baronial resentment and pushed the kingdom closer to civil war. The young prince observed these events from within the royal household, learning lessons about power, loyalty, and the dangers of weakness that would shape his character for life. He saw how his father's inability to command respect had led to disaster after disaster, how royal authority could be undermined by poor judgment and worse advisors. These early experiences taught him that medieval kingship demanded not just royal blood, but also the strength and skill to maintain that blood upon the throne. By 1321, when Edward was 9 years old, civil war had erupted across England. The Despencer War, as it came to be known, pitted the king and his favourites against a coalition of rebellious barons led by Thomas, Earl of Lancaster, Edward II's own cousin. The young prince watched as royal armies marched against English nobles, as castles changed hands and loyalty shifted like sand in an hourglass. The conflict reached its climax at the Battle of Boroughbridge in March 1322, where Thomas of Lancaster was defeated and captured. His subsequent execution marked a temporary victory for Edward II, but it was a hollow triumph that solved none of the underlying problems plaguing the realm. The killing of Lancaster, a prince of the blood royal, shocked even those who had opposed him, and it further damaged Edward II's already tarnished reputation. As the prince entered adolescence, his mother Isabella's relationship with his father had deteriorated beyond repair. The Queen's growing alienation from her husband created additional instability within the royal family and offered fresh opportunities for Edward II's enemies to exploit. Isabella's French connections, her intelligence, and her fierce determination would soon make her a formidable political force in her own right. The year 1324 brought a new crisis that would ultimately seal Edward II's fate. A dispute over the building of a French fortress at Saint-Sardos in Gascony provided the excuse for Charles IV of France to declare Edward II's French territories forfeit. This challenge struck at the heart of the complex feudal relationships that bound the English crown to continental possessions, territories that provided both wealth and prestige to the Plantagenet dynasty. Young Edward found himself thrust into the center of this diplomatic crisis when his father made the fateful decision to send him to France to perform homage for the Duchy of Aquitaine. The king's reluctance to travel to France personally, fearing that his absence might encourage domestic rebellion, led to this arrangement that would ultimately destroy his reign. The 13-year-old prince was created Duke of Aquitaine and prepared for a journey that would change the course of English history. Isabella accompanied her son to France, ostensibly to help negotiate a peaceful resolution to the territorial dispute. Yet once across the Channel, the Queen found herself in a position to act upon the grievances that had accumulated during years of unhappy marriage. Surrounded by her French relatives and free from the constraints that had bound her in England, Isabella began to plot her husband's downfall. The court of Charles IV offered Isabella both sanctuary and support for her growing ambitions. Her brother, the French king, had his own reasons for opposing Edward II, not least the English king's continued defiance of French suzerainty over Gascony. The combination of Isabella's personal grievances and French political interests created a dangerous alliance that would soon threaten Edward II's very survival. During their stay in France, Isabella and her son were joined by Roger Mortimer, a marcher lord who had escaped from the Tower of London and fled to the continent. Mortimer brought with him intimate knowledge of English politics and military affairs, as well as deep-seated hatred for the Despensers and their royal protector. His relationship with Isabella, which soon became both political and personal, provided the foundation for the conspiracy that would ultimately topple Edward II. The young Prince Edward found himself at the center of these machinations, his very person serving as both justification and instrument for his mother's plans. Isabella proclaimed that she was acting to protect her son from the malign influence of the Despensers, who she claimed were poisoning his father's mind against his own family. This narrative of maternal protection and filial duty provided moral cover for what was, in essence, a plan for armed rebellion and regicide. To finance their planned invasion of England, Isabella arranged Edward's betrothal to Philippa of Hainaut, daughter of William, Count of Hainaut. This marriage alliance brought both diplomatic support and much-needed financial resources to Isabella's cause. The betrothal ceremony, conducted with great pomp in the French court, marked the point of no return for the conspirators. As 1326 drew to its close, the 14-year-old Prince Edward stood upon the threshold of a destiny he had never chosen. Within months, he would return to England not as his father's heir, but as his successor, crowned king by his mother's triumph and his father's destruction. The lessons of these formative years, the importance of strength, the dangers of favorites, the need for noble support, and the ruthless nature of political survival would guide his actions for the next half-century of his remarkable reign. The child, who had been born into chaos, was about to inherit a kingdom in ruins, but within that kingdom lay the seeds of greatness that would make him one of England's most celebrated monarchs. Edward III's story was just beginning, and it would prove to be a tale of military glory, political innovation, and ultimately the tragic consequences of unbridled ambition. The invasion fleet that carried 14-year-old Edward back to England in September 1326 brought with it the winds of revolution that would sweep away his father's tottering regime. Isabella and Mortimer had assembled a modest but determined force, bolstered by Flemish mercenaries and English exiles who had fled Edward II's vindictive rule. Yet their greatest weapon was not steel or gold, but the righteous anger of a kingdom pushed beyond endurance by years of misgovernment and humiliation. The teenage prince found himself playing a role he had never auditioned for, serving as the living symbol of legitimate authority, while real power resided in the hands of his mother and her lover. As their ships approached the English coast, Edward must have contemplated the strange turn of fortune that had transformed him from a powerless exile into the figurehead of a revolution. The boy who had fled England as a duke returned as a king in all but name. Yet this elevation came at a terrible cost to his family and his peace of mind. The collapse of Edward II's resistance proved remarkably swift and complete. Noble after noble abandoned the failing king, drawn by a combination of genuine grievance and calculated opportunism. The Despensers, who had wielded such power and accumulated such wealth through royal favour, found themselves friendless and hunted as their enemies closed in. Hugh Despenser the Younger met a particularly gruesome end, executed with the savage cruelty that medieval justice reserved for those who had risen too high and fallen too far. Edward II himself fled westward, seeking refuge in Wales, where he hoped the loyalty of his Welsh subjects might provide sanctuary. Yet even this last hope proved illusory. The king, who had once commanded the obedience of all England, found himself abandoned and alone, reduced to hiding in remote castles, while his kingdom crumbled around him. His capture in November 1326 marked the effective end of his reign, though the formal proceedings would drag on for several more months. The young Prince Edward watched these events unfold with emotions that can only be imagined. To witness the fall of one's father, to see royal authority collapse so completely and so publicly, must have been profoundly traumatic for any adolescent. Yet Edward showed remarkable composure during this difficult period, perhaps understanding instinctively that any display of weakness might endanger not only himself, but also his future claim to the throne. The process of Edward II's deposition required careful legal and political choreography. A parliament was summoned to meet in Westminster in January 1327, though this assembly bore little resemblance to the traditional gatherings of nobles, clergy, and commons that had served previous monarchs. Instead, it was a revolutionary body dominated by Isabella's supporters and designed to provide legal cover for what amounted to a dynastic coup. The charges levelled against Edward II read like a catalogue of royal failings accumulated over 2 decades of unsuccessful rule. He was accused of incompetence in government, of losing territories that rightfully belonged to the English crown, of failing to maintain the dignity and honour appropriate to his station. Most damning of all, he was charged with allowing evil counsellors to guide his actions, thereby bringing ruin upon the realm and misery upon his subjects. On January 25th, 1327, this compliant parliament formally deposed Edward II and proclaimed his 14-year-old son as King Edward III. The ceremony of abdication took place at Kenilworth Castle, where the fallen monarch was compelled to renounce his crown, before a delegation of lords and commons. Contemporary accounts describe Edward II weeping as he surrendered the symbols of his authority, recognizing perhaps that this political death would likely be followed by physical extinction. The coronation of Edward III took place at Westminster Abbey on February 1st, 1327, conducted with all the ancient ritual and ceremonial magnificence that the English crown could command. Yet beneath the golden splendor and sacred solemnity lay the uncomfortable reality that this king owed his throne not to natural succession, but to armed rebellion and forced abdication. The 14-year-old boy, who knelt before the Archbishop of Canterbury, carried with him the burden of illegitimate origins that would shadow the early years of his reign. Real power, of course, remained firmly in the hands of Isabella and Mortimer, who established themselves as the true rulers of England while maintaining the fiction of royal authority. Henry, Earl of Lancaster, was appointed as the young king's nominal guardian, but this was largely a ceremonial position designed to provide constitutional respectability to what was essentially a regency dominated by the Queen Mother and her lover. The new regime's first major challenge came in the form of Scotland, where Robert the Bruce continued to press his advantage against English weakness. A Scottish invasion of northern England in the summer of 1327 provided an opportunity for the young king to experience his first taste of military campaigning, though the expedition proved to be a humiliating failure that further damaged English prestige. Edward rode north at the head of an army that included many of the greatest nobles in the land, yet the campaign quickly dissolved into confusion and ineffectiveness. The Scots avoided pitched battle with characteristic skill, melting away into the hills and moors whenever the English forces approached. Meanwhile, Scottish raiders struck at English supply lines and isolated detachments, making the invaders' position increasingly precarious. The low point of the campaign came at Stanhope Park in County Durham, where the English army was outmaneuvered and humiliated by a much smaller Scottish force. The young king found himself trapped in his camp while enemy raiders struck at will, stealing horses and supplies with impunity. One night, Scottish warriors penetrated so close to the royal tent that Edward had to be hustled away to safety, a narrow escape that left him shaken and his followers demoralized. The failure of this Scottish expedition forced Isabella and Mortimer to accept a humiliating peace that effectively recognized Scottish independence. The Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton, signed in March 1328, represented the complete abandonment of Edward I's Scottish conquests and the triumph of Robert the Bruce's long struggle for recognition. For young Edward, watching his kingdom surrender territories that his grandfather had won at such great cost, the treaty provided another painful lesson in the consequences of military weakness. The marriage arrangements concluded as part of the Scottish peace were particularly galling to English pride. Edward's younger sister Joan was betrothed to David, son of Robert the Bruce, linking the English royal family directly to their former enemies through bonds of kinship. This diplomatic marriage, while strategically sound, symbolized the extent to which English power had declined since the glorious days of Edward I. Edward's own marriage to Philippa of Hainault took place at York Minster on January 24, 1328, fulfilling the betrothal agreement made during the conspiracy in France. The ceremony was conducted with appropriate royal splendor, though the young king was barely 15 years old and his bride only 13. Their union had been arranged for purely political purposes, yet it would prove to be one of the happiest royal marriages in English history. Philippa brought with her not only the diplomatic support of her family's extensive European connections, but also a dowry that helped stabilize the new regime's finances. More importantly, she possessed the intelligence, dignity, and strength of character that would make her an ideal partner for the demanding role of medieval queenship. Her influence on Edward's development during these crucial early years cannot be overstated. The birth of their first child, Edward of Woodstock, later known as the Black Prince, on June 15th, 1330, marked another milestone in the young king's personal development and political position. The arrival of a male heir to the Plantagenet dynasty provided reassurance that the royal line would continue, while also complicating the power dynamics at court. Mortimer, who had grown increasingly arrogant and grasping during his years of dominance, began to view the king's growing family as a potential threat to his own position. Indeed, by 1330, the relationship between Edward and his mother's lover had deteriorated significantly. The young king, now approaching his 18th birthday, increasingly chafed under the restrictions imposed by Mortimer's regime. The Earl had become the de facto ruler of England, accumulating titles, lands, and wealth, while treating Edward more like a junior partner than a reigning monarch. This situation was politically unsustainable and personally intolerable to a young man who possessed both royal pride and growing confidence in his own abilities. Mortimer's behavior became increasingly erratic and despotic as he consolidated his power. He had himself created Earl of March in 1328, claiming royal blood through his descent from the Welsh princes of Powys. His acquisition of vast estates, particularly in Wales and the Marches, created resentment among other nobles who saw their own positions threatened by his insatiable appetite for land and influence. The execution of Edmund, Earl of Kent, Edward's uncle, in March 1330, proved to be the final straw that turned the king decisively against Mortimer. Kent had been tricked into believing that Edward II was still alive and had been induced to participate in a supposed plot to restore the deposed king. Mortimer used this manufactured conspiracy as an excuse to eliminate a potential rival, but the judicial murder of a prince of the blood royal shocked even his supporters and demonstrated that no one was safe from his vindictive wrath. Edward began to plan his counter-coup with the careful secrecy that would characterize his approach to politics throughout his reign. He gathered around himself a small group of trusted companions, young nobles who shared his frustration with Mortimer's dominance and his desire to claim his rightful authority. Chief among these was William Montague, heir to the earldom of Salisbury, who would remain one of Edward's closest friends and most reliable supporters throughout his long reign. The king's opportunity came in October 1330, when the court was residing at Nottingham Castle. Despite its reputation as an impregnable fortress, the castle possessed a secret weakness in the form of a cave system that provided access to the interior through a passage known as Mortimer's Hole. Edward's supporters used this route to penetrate the castle's defences and seize the Earl before he could organise resistance or escape. The capture of Mortimer on the night of October 19th, 1330, marked the real beginning of Edward III's personal rule. The young king, not yet 18 years old, had demonstrated the cunning, courage, and decisiveness that would characterize his approach to kingship throughout his long reign. By striking swiftly and decisively against the man who had dominated his minority, Edward showed that he possessed the ruthless determination necessary for medieval monarchy. Mortimer was taken to London and tried before his peers in Parliament, though the outcome was never in doubt. The charges against him included the murder of Edward II, whose death in Berkeley Castle in September 1327 was now laid at Mortimer's door, the judicial murder of the Earl of Kent, and the general crime of accumulating excessive power to the detriment of the realm. He was executed at Tyburn on November 29, 1330, meeting his end with the same brutality he had shown to his own enemies. Isabella, meanwhile, was treated with the respect due to a queen mother, but was effectively removed from political power. Edward showed remarkable restraint in dealing with his mother, refusing to pursue charges against her, despite her complicity in Mortimer's crimes. She was provided with a comfortable retirement and generous income, but her days of wielding political influence were over. The young king had learned to separate personal feeling from political necessity, a skill that would serve him well in the challenges that lay ahead. At 17 years old, Edward III finally stood as king in fact as well as name. The lessons of his minority, the importance of personal strength, the dangers of over-mighty subjects, the need for decisive action in moments of crisis, had been burned into his consciousness through bitter experience. He had seen how weakness could lead to disaster and how strength, properly applied, could restore royal authority even against seemingly impossible odds. The England that Edward now ruled directly remained deeply scarred by the traumas of the previous decades. The Scottish border was effectively lost, royal finances were in chaos, and the nobility remained divided between former supporters of Edward II, adherents of Isabella and Mortimer, and opportunists who had backed whichever side seemed likely to prevail. Yet within this damaged kingdom lay the resources and potential that would make Edward III's reign one of the most successful and glorious in English history. The young king's first task was to restore the dignity and effectiveness of royal government, while healing the wounds left by years of civil strife and foreign humiliation. He possessed natural advantages in this endeavor: intelligence, charisma, physical prowess, and an intuitive understanding of the political arts. But success would require more than personal qualities alone. Edward would need to master the complex arts of medieval statecraft, building coalitions among the nobility while maintaining his independence, managing parliament while preserving royal prerogative, and conducting foreign policy while rebuilding domestic strength. The transformation of this 17-year-old survivor of political chaos into one of England's greatest warrior kings represents one of the most remarkable personal developments in medieval history. Yet that transformation was just beginning in 1330, as Edward III prepared to claim not merely the throne of England, but a place among the greatest monarchs of his age. The dawn of Edward III's personal rule in 1330 revealed a kingdom scarred by decades of humiliation and defeat, yet possessed of resources and potential that awaited only the touch of strong leadership to transform weakness into strength. At 17 years of age, the young king faced challenges that would have daunted rulers twice his age and experience. The Scottish border lay essentially defenseless. Royal authority had been undermined by years of factional strife, and England's reputation for military prowess had been shattered by a series of embarrassing defeats. Yet within Edward's character lay qualities that would prove perfectly suited to the demands of his age. Unlike his father, who had shrunk from the martial responsibilities of medieval kingship, Edward embraced warfare as both duty and pleasure. He possessed the physical attributes that commanded respect in a warrior society: tall stature, impressive strength, and the kind of presence that drew men's eyes and loyalty. More importantly, he combined these natural gifts with a sharp intelligence that allowed him to master the complex arts of military strategy, political maneuvering, and royal leadership. Edward's first priority was the restoration of English prestige on the Scottish border, where Robert the Bruce's continued success had reduced English authority to a shadow of its former self. The humiliating Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton had recognised Scottish independence, but the young king had no intention of accepting this situation as permanent. His grandfather's conquests might have been lost, but they were not forgotten, and Edward began almost immediately to seek opportunities for reversing the disasters of his father's reign. The opportunity he sought came through the complex dynamics of Scottish succession politics. Robert the Bruce, had died in 1329, leaving behind a 5-year-old son, David II, whose minority government faced the same challenges that had nearly destroyed Edward's own early reign. Scottish nobles who had been dispossessed by Bruce's victory began to look southward for support in their efforts to reclaim lost lands and positions. Chief among these disinherited Scottish nobles was Edward Balliol, son of the former King John Balliol, who had ruled Scotland under English overlordship before Robert the Bruce's successful rebellion. Balliol's claim to the Scottish throne was legally questionable, but politically useful, providing Edward with a potential puppet through whom English influence might be restored north of the border. Edward's support for the disinherited took the form of tacit encouragement rather than open assistance, allowing him to maintain plausible deniability if their enterprise failed. This careful approach demonstrated the political sophistication he had acquired during his traumatic minority, showing that he understood the importance of limiting risks while maximizing potential gains. The lesson of Mortimer's overreach had not been lost on the young king. The expedition launched by Edward Balliol and his supporters in the summer of 1332 achieved success beyond anyone's expectations. Landing in Fife with a small force of English and disinherited Scottish knights, Balliol's army surprised and defeated a much larger Scottish force at Duplin Moor on August 11, 1332. The victory was complete and devastating, with the Scottish Earl of Mar and thousands of his followers killed in a battle that demonstrated the tactical superiority of disciplined heavy cavalry over disorganized feudal levies. Balliol's subsequent coronation at Scone on September 24, 1332, appeared to restore English influence in Scotland at a stroke, yet this triumph proved as fragile as it was dramatic. Within months, Balliol had been driven from his throne by a resurgent Scottish Patriot Party loyal to the infant David II. By December 1332, the would-be King of Scots was fleeing south across the border, seeking Edward's direct support for his desperate cause. The failure of Balliol's first attempt to secure his throne provided Edward with the justification he needed for open intervention in Scottish affairs. The young king could now claim that he was merely supporting a legitimate ally, rather than pursuing aggressive expansion for its own sake. This legal fiction satisfied neither his critics nor his enemies, but it provided sufficient cover for the military expedition that Edward had been planning since the moment he assumed personal power. Edward's Scottish campaign of 1333 demonstrated both his natural talents as a military commander and his ability to learn from the mistakes of his predecessors. Rather than attempting to conquer and hold Scottish territory directly, he focused on a more limited objective that would yield maximum political advantage with minimum risk. The siege of Berwick-upon-Tweed, begun in March 1333, targeted Scotland's most important border fortress and commercial centre. Berwick had changed hands multiple times during the wars between England and Scotland, serving as a symbol of national prestige for whichever side controlled it. Edward's siege of the town was conducted with a professionalism and efficiency that contrasted sharply with the confused expeditions of his father's reign. The young king supervised every aspect of the operation personally, demonstrating the attention to detail that would characterize his approach to military affairs throughout his career. The Scottish attempt to relieve Berwick led to the Battle of Halidon Hill on July 19, 1333, where Edward won his first great military victory and announced his arrival as one of Europe's most formidable commanders. The tactical dispositions he chose for this battle would become the template for English success throughout the coming decades, combining the firepower of massed longbowmen with the shock action of dismounted men-at-arms in a defensive formation that proved nearly unbeatable. The Scottish army that advanced against Edward's position represented the flower of Scottish chivalry, led by Archibald Douglas, Guardian of Scotland, and including many of the most experienced commanders in the kingdom. Yet their traditional tactics of frontal assault by heavily armoured knights proved disastrously inappropriate against Edward's innovative defensive array. Wave after wave of Scottish attacks broke against the English position, leaving the field littered with noble corpses and the Scottish cause in ruins. Douglas himself fell in the battle, along with 5 earls and countless lesser nobles, whose deaths effectively decapitated the Scottish resistance. The victory was so complete that it restored Edward Balliol to his throne and forced the young David II into French exile. More importantly for Edward's development, it demonstrated that English arms could still triumph over their enemies when properly led and efficiently organised. The fall of Berwick followed inevitably upon the destruction of the Scottish army, giving Edward control of the most important fortress on the northern border. The town's commercial significance, combined with its strategic location, made this conquest a substantial addition to English power and prestige. The young king had succeeded where his father had failed repeatedly, restoring English dominance through superior generalship and tactical innovation. Edward's return from Scotland in triumph marked a fundamental shift in the dynamics of English politics. No longer could he be dismissed as an untested youth who owed his throne to his mother's rebellion. The victor of Halidon Hill had proven his competence as both military commander and political leader, earning the respect of nobles who had previously viewed him with skepticism or condescension. This newfound respect allowed Edward to begin the delicate process of reconstructing English noble society after the devastation of the previous decades. The factional divisions that had torn the kingdom apart during his father's reign and his own minority could not be healed overnight, but military success provided a foundation upon which lasting reconciliation might be built. Victory had a way of papering over past grievances and creating new bonds of loyalty between king and subjects. The young king demonstrated considerable political sophistication in his approach to this reconciliation. Rather than seeking revenge against former enemies or showing excessive favour to his early supporters, Edward adopted a policy of calculated magnanimity that gradually drew former opponents into his service. His treatment of Henry of Lancaster, brother of the executed Thomas, and potentially a dangerous rival, exemplified this approach. Instead of viewing Henry as a threat, Edward cultivated him as an ally, ultimately making him one of his most trusted commanders. Edward's creation of new earls in 1337 represented both the culmination of this reconciliation process and a masterpiece of political management. The 6 men elevated to comital rank: Hugh de Audley to Gloucester, William de Bohun to Northampton, William de Clinton to Huntingdon, Henry of Grosmont to Derby, William de Montague to Salisbury, and Robert de Ufford to Suffolk, represented a careful balance of different interests and factions within the nobility. These new earls were not random selections, but carefully chosen individuals who had demonstrated loyalty to Edward's cause while possessing the personal qualities necessary for effective leadership. Montague and Ufford had been his companions in the coup against Mortimer, while Bohun and Clinton had shown their worth in the Scottish campaigns. Audley brought valuable administrative experience, and Grosmont possessed the military talents that had made his father one of England's most respected commanders. The elevation of these 6 men served multiple purposes simultaneously. It rewarded loyalty and competence, creating a group of nobles whose interests were directly tied to Edward's success. It provided the king with a reliable core of supporters in the House of Lords, essential for managing Parliament and securing approval for royal policies. Most importantly, it created new sources of military leadership for the expanded campaigns that Edward was already planning. Edward's approach to military organization reflected the lessons he had learned from his early experiences and his study of successful commanders from the past. Unlike his father, who had relied heavily on traditional feudal levies that served for limited periods and often with questionable loyalty, Edward began developing what amounted to a professional military system based on paid service and personal contracts. The king's household knights formed the core of this new military establishment, serving as both his personal bodyguard and the cadre around which larger forces could be organized. These men were bound to Edward by ties of personal loyalty and shared experience that went far beyond the traditional obligations of feudal service. Many had fought beside him in Scotland, or had participated in the dramatic coup that had overthrown Mortimer, creating bonds forged in common danger and mutual dependence. Edward's innovations extended beyond military organization to encompass the broader culture of English knighthood. His court became a center of chivalric activity that attracted ambitious young nobles from across Europe, all eager to participate in the revival of English martial glory. Tournaments and other knightly exercises provided both training for warfare and opportunities for Edward to assess the capabilities of potential followers. The king's own participation in these chivalric activities was crucial to their success. Unlike many monarchs who preferred to observe from a safe distance, Edward threw himself into the mock combats and competitions with enthusiasm that both demonstrated his personal courage and cemented his bonds with his followers. His prowess in the lists became legendary, contributing to a personal mystique that would serve him well in the more serious business of actual warfare. Edward's domestic policies during this period focused on restoring royal authority and rebuilding the institutional foundations of effective government. The chaos of his father's reign and his own minority had left royal administration in disarray, with many traditional sources of revenue compromised and the machinery of government functioning poorly. The young king approached these challenges with the same systematic attention to detail that had characterized his military reforms. The restoration of royal finances required both immediate measures to address pressing needs and long-term reforms to establish sustainable sources of income. Edward's early financial difficulties had been compounded by the enormous costs of his Scottish campaigns, which had drained the treasury even as they restored royal prestige. The king needed to find ways of funding increasingly expensive military operations while maintaining the domestic prosperity that made such expenditures possible. One of Edward's most significant innovations was his development of new approaches to parliamentary taxation that balanced royal needs with subjects' rights, rather than viewing Parliament as an obstacle to be overcome or circumvented. The young king began to see it as a partner in governance whose cooperation was essential for long-term success. This represented a fundamental shift from his father's adversarial relationship with parliamentary institutions. The king's approach to noble relationships during this formative period established patterns that would characterize his reign for the next 4 decades. Edward understood intuitively that medieval monarchy required the willing cooperation of the aristocracy, but he also recognized that this cooperation had to be earned through success and maintained through careful management of competing interests and ambitions. Edward's court during the early 1330s became a magnet for ambitious young nobles from across Europe, drawn by the combination of military opportunity and royal favor that the king offered to those who served him well. This international character of Edward's following would prove crucial in his later continental campaigns, providing him with commanders who possessed both local knowledge and personal loyalty to the English cause. The development of Edward's personality during these crucial years reflected the complex interplay between natural temperament and the demands of his position. Contemporary observers noted his remarkable combination of physical courage and political calculation, traits that allowed him to take bold risks while minimizing the chances of catastrophic failure. This balanced approach to leadership would serve him well in the greater challenges that lay ahead. By 1337, 7 years after assuming personal rule, Edward had transformed both himself and his kingdom. The uncertain teenager who had overthrown Mortimer had matured into a confident monarch whose authority was unquestioned and whose military reputation was already spreading across Europe. The institutional foundations of royal government had been restored and strengthened. The nobility had been reconciled to royal leadership, and England's military forces had been rebuilt according to new principles that would soon revolutionize European warfare. Yet perhaps the most important transformation was in Edward's own conception of his role and destiny. No longer content with merely ruling England effectively, the young king had begun to contemplate grander ambitions that would ultimately lead to his claim on the French throne and the opening of the 100 Years' War. The boy who had fled to France as an exile was preparing to return as a conqueror, armed with the confidence that success had bred and the military innovations that would make English victory possible. The stage was set for Edward III to emerge from the shadow of his father's failures and his own troubled minority, to claim a place among the great warrior kings of medieval Europe. The lessons learned during these formative years, the importance of military success, the need for noble support, the value of political flexibility, and the dangers of overreaching ambition, would guide his actions throughout the remarkable career that lay ahead. The death of Charles IV of France on February 1st, 1328, created a succession crisis that would ultimately consume the next century of European history in warfare, devastation, and the pursuit of dynastic ambitions that far exceeded any reasonable calculation of cost and benefit. Yet in the immediate aftermath of the French king's death, few could have predicted the catastrophic consequences that would flow from what appeared to be a relatively straightforward question of feudal inheritance. Charles IV had ruled France for 6 years, following his brothers Louis X and Philip V to the grave without leaving a male heir, to continue the direct Capetian line that had governed France for over 3 centuries. His death created a vacuum of royal authority that drew competing claimants like moths to a flame, each basing their pretensions on different interpretations of inheritance law and feudal custom. The two principal claimants represented fundamentally different visions of French kingship and European politics. Philip of Valois, son of Charles of Valois, and thus Charles IV's cousin, embodied the French nobility's preference for native rule and their deep suspicion of foreign influence. His claim rested on agnatic succession through the male line, a principle that had been gradually established through French legal precedents over the previous decades. Edward III's competing claim derived from his status as Charles IV's nephew, through his mother Isabella, sister of the deceased king. According to the principle of proximity of blood, Edward stood closer to Charles IV than Philip of Valois, making him the rightful heir to the French crown. Yet this interpretation required accepting female transmission of royal rights, a concept that the French nobility found both legally questionable and politically unacceptable. The assembly of French magnates that met to determine the succession faced a choice between legal theory and political reality. While Edward's genealogical claim might have been stronger in purely hereditary terms, the prospect of England and France being united under a single crown horrified the French nobility. They remembered all too well the vast Angevin empire that had once dominated both sides of the English Channel, and they had no desire to see such a threat to French independence revived. The French decision in favour of Philip VI represented more than mere dynastic preference. It reflected a fundamental shift in European political consciousness toward territorial nationalism and away from the feudal cosmopolitanism that had characterized earlier centuries. The French nobility was choosing to be ruled by a Frenchman, rather than submit to a foreign king. however legitimate his claim might appear in legal terms. Edward's initial response to the French decision demonstrated both political realism and strategic calculation. The young king was still consolidating his authority in England and dealing with the ongoing Scottish crisis, leaving him in no position to challenge the French succession by force of arms. His formal protest, followed by submission and homage to Philip VI, represented a tactical retreat designed to buy time, while he strengthened his position. The homage ceremony performed by Edward at Amiens in 1329 carried profound symbolic significance for both kingdoms. The sight of the English king kneeling before his French counterpart and acknowledging feudal subordination represented the continuation of a relationship that had persisted since the Norman conquest. Yet the ceremony also carried undertones of future conflict, as Edward's obvious reluctance and the strained formality of the proceedings suggested that this feudal submission might prove temporary. The fundamental problem underlying Anglo-French relations was the impossible situation created by Edward's dual status as sovereign king of England and feudal vassal of France for his continental possessions. This contradiction had created friction between the two kingdoms for centuries, but it became increasingly untenable as both monarchies grew stronger and more centralized. The personal rule of two ambitious young kings made some form of conflict virtually inevitable. Philip VI's decision to confiscate Gascony in May 1337 provided the immediate trigger for the outbreak of hostilities, but the underlying causes of the war ran much deeper than this single provocative act. The French king's action represented an attempt to resolve the feudal contradiction by force, stripping Edward of his continental possessions and eliminating the source of ongoing jurisdictional disputes. Edward's response to the confiscation of Gascony demonstrated how completely his political thinking had evolved since his accession to personal rule. Rather than accepting the loss of his French territories or seeking some face-saving compromise, the English king chose to escalate the conflict by reviving his dormant claim to the French throne. This decision transformed a feudal dispute into a dynastic war that would outlast both protagonists and their immediate successors. The formal assumption of the French royal title by Edward in January 1340 marked the point of no return in Anglo-French relations. By styling himself King of France and the French royal arms, Edward was not merely asserting a legal claim, but challenging the entire basis of Valois legitimacy. This was a declaration of war that could only be resolved through the complete victory of one dynasty over the other. Edward's strategy for making good his French claims required careful diplomatic preparation before military action could succeed. The English king understood that France was the largest, richest, and most populous kingdom in Western Europe, making direct confrontation extremely risky without substantial Allied support. His diplomatic initiatives therefore focused on building a coalition of continental powers that might help offset French advantages in resources and manpower. The Low Countries provided the most promising theatre for English diplomatic activity, as the commercial cities of Flanders depended heavily on English wool for their textile industries. This economic interdependence created natural grounds for political alliance, particularly when French royal policy threatened to disrupt the profitable trade relationships that sustained Flemish prosperity. Jacob van Artevelde emerged as Edward's most important continental ally during the early stages of the conflict, using his position as leader of the Flemish communes to bring the major cities into alliance with England. Artevelde's success in persuading Ghent, Bruges, and Ypres to recognize Edward as the rightful king of France provided crucial political cover for what would otherwise have appeared as naked English aggression against French sovereignty. The proclamation of Edward as King of France by the Flemish cities in 1340 represented a diplomatic triumph that helped legitimize English claims in the eyes of neutral observers. If substantial French territories and populations were willing to acknowledge Edward's royal title, then his pretensions appeared less like foreign conquest and more like the restoration of rightful authority. This perception would prove valuable in maintaining English morale during the long years of warfare that lay ahead. Edward's alliance with Emperor Louis IV provided additional legitimacy for his cause, while opening the possibility of German military support against France. The emperor's recognition of Edward's French claims and his appointment as Vicar General of the Holy Roman Empire created formal legal justification for English intervention in French affairs. Yet German support proved largely theoretical, as Louis was too preoccupied with his own conflicts to provide substantial military assistance. The economic dimensions of the Anglo-French conflict were as important as its political and military aspects. Edward's control of the English wool trade gave him a powerful weapon against French interests, as disruption of this commerce would cause severe economic hardship in Flanders and other regions dependent on textile production. The king's manipulation of wool exports demonstrated sophisticated understanding of economic warfare decades before such concepts became widely accepted. French naval strength in the English Channel posed a serious threat to English commerce and communications with continental allies. Philip VI's assembly of a large fleet off the Norman coast in 1336 created genuine fears of French invasion, forcing Edward to divert resources from offensive operations to defensive preparations. The threat of French naval superiority would influence English strategic planning throughout the early years of the war. The Battle of Sluys on June 24, 1340, marked Edward's first major victory in his French war and established English naval supremacy that would persist for the remainder of the conflict. The destruction of the French fleet not only eliminated the immediate threat of invasion, but also secured English communications with their Flemish allies and opened the possibility of large-scale military operations on the continent. Edward's personal participation in the Battle of Sluys demonstrated his commitment to leading from the front and sharing the dangers faced by his followers. Contemporary accounts describe the English king fighting in the thick of the action, wielding sword and battle axe with deadly effectiveness. This personal courage became legendary among his followers and helped establish the cult of royal leadership that would characterize his reign. The victory at Sluys was complete and devastating for French naval power. Contemporary estimates suggest that over 16,000 French sailors and soldiers were killed in the battle, with only a handful escaping to carry news of the disaster to Philip VI. The French captain Nicolas Béhuchet was hanged from his own yardarm in a gesture that symbolized the complete reversal of naval fortunes between the two kingdoms. The psychological impact of Sluys extended far beyond its immediate military consequences. For the first time in living memory, English arms had achieved a decisive victory over their continental enemies, restoring confidence that had been shattered by decades of Scottish defeats and diplomatic humiliations. The victory also demonstrated the effectiveness of Edward's military innovations and justified the substantial investments he had made in rebuilding English military capabilities. Yet the triumph at Sluys also revealed the limitations of English resources and the enormous costs of continental warfare. Despite his naval victory, Edward found himself unable to capitalize on his success due to financial exhaustion. The king was forced to return to England to address mounting debts and seek additional parliamentary funding before military operations could be resumed. The pattern established during these early years of the war, dramatic English victories followed by periods of financial crisis and strategic paralysis, would characterize much of the subsequent conflict. Edward's military genius and tactical innovations could win battles, but they could not solve the fundamental problem of England's limited resources compared to the vast wealth and population of France. The siege and capture of Calais in 1347 represented perhaps Edward's most significant strategic achievement during the opening phase of the war. The importance of this fortress city on the English Channel cannot be overstated. It provided England with a permanent foothold on the continent, a base for future operations, and a symbol of English power that would endure for over 2 centuries. The siege of Calais demonstrated Edward's understanding that military success required more than battlefield victories. It demanded the systematic application of overwhelming force over extended periods. The 11-month siege revealed both the strengths and limitations of medieval warfare, showing how determined resistance could be overcome through persistence and superior resources, while also highlighting the enormous costs involved in such operations. The famous episode of the Burghers of Calais, immortalized by later chroniclers and artists, illustrated both Edward's capacity for mercy and his shrewd understanding of political theatre. The king's initial demand for 6 prominent citizens to surrender themselves for execution was calculated to demonstrate French humiliation, while his subsequent clemency, supposedly at Queen Philippa's intercession, showed royal magnanimity. The entire episode served multiple purposes simultaneously, satisfying English desires for revenge while demonstrating royal justice and providing a narrative that enhanced Edward's reputation for both strength and mercy. By 1347, Edward III had established himself as one of Europe's most formidable military commanders, while laying the foundations for a conflict that would define the next century of European history. His claims to the French throne had been backed by substantial military success. His alliance system had proven its worth in both diplomatic and military terms, and his tactical innovations had revolutionized the conduct of medieval warfare. Yet the young king had also learned harsh lessons about the limitations of English power and the enormous costs of continental ambitions. The financial strain of his early campaigns had nearly bankrupted the English crown, while the military commitments required to maintain his French conquests threatened to drain England's limited manpower reserves. These constraints would force Edward to adopt increasingly sophisticated approaches to strategy and diplomacy as the war entered its next phase. The foundation had been laid for Edward III's emergence as the dominant figure in 14th century European politics. Yet the greatest triumphs and most crushing disappointments of his reign still lay ahead. The claim to France that had begun as a diplomatic maneuver to justify resistance to Philip VI's aggression had evolved into a dynastic obsession that would shape the remainder of Edward's life and the future of both kingdoms. The decade of the 1340s marked the pinnacle of Edward III's military genius and the zenith of medieval English power on the European continent. These years witnessed victories so complete and devastating that they became legendary throughout Christendom, establishing Edward as the preeminent warrior king of his age and creating a mystique of English invincibility that would endure for generations. Yet these triumphs came at enormous cost, both in resources and human life, and they set precedents for total warfare that would ultimately consume both kingdoms in centuries of devastating conflict. The Crécy campaign of 1346 began as what appeared to be another large-scale raid into French territory, similar to the earlier expeditions that had brought Edward limited success and substantial plunder. Yet this campaign would prove to be fundamentally different in both scope and consequences, marking the moment when English military innovation encountered French traditional tactics in a collision that would reshape the nature of medieval warfare forever. Edward's decision to launch this campaign represented a calculated gamble based on his growing confidence in English military capabilities and his assessment of French political weaknesses. Intelligence reports suggested that Philip VI was facing growing domestic opposition to his expensive and unsuccessful war policies, while the French army remained wedded to tactical approaches that had proven vulnerable to English innovations. The English king saw an opportunity to strike a decisive blow that might end the war on favourable terms. The landing at Saint-Vaast-la-Hougue on July the 12th, 1346, demonstrated the sophisticated logistical planning that had become characteristic of Edward's military operations. The English invasion force, numbering approximately 15,000 men, represented one of the largest armies ever transported across the English Channel up to that time. The successful disembarkation of such a massive force, complete with horses, supplies, and siege equipment, testified to the administrative competence that Edward had developed during his years of continental campaigning. The composition of Edward's army reflected the social and tactical revolution that had transformed English military organisation under his leadership. Unlike the traditional feudal levies that had dominated medieval warfare for centuries, this force was essentially professional in character, bound together by contracts of service, common training, and shared experience of previous campaigns. The backbone of the army consisted of longbowmen drawn from the yeomanry of England and Wales, supported by men-at-arms whose equipment and tactics had been modified to complement rather than compete with missile warfare. Edward's eldest son, Edward of Woodstock, participated in this campaign as a 16-year-old prince, receiving his first taste of serious military action. The young man, who would later be known as the Black Prince, had inherited his father's physical courage and tactical intelligence, qualities that would make him one of the most feared military commanders of his generation. His presence in the campaign provided both practical military value and powerful symbolic significance, demonstrating the dynastic continuity of English martial excellence. The march across Normandy revealed both the destructive potential and the strategic limitations of Edward's approach to warfare. The English army moved like a consuming fire across the Norman countryside, burning cities, destroying crops, and slaughtering livestock in a systematic campaign of economic warfare designed to undermine French resources while enriching English soldiers. The sack of Caen on July 26th demonstrated the professional efficiency with which Edward's forces could reduce even strongly fortified positions when properly motivated and skillfully led. Yet this destructive progress also revealed the fundamental weakness of Edward's strategic position. The English army was operating deep in enemy territory with extended supply lines and no secure base of operations. Every day spent in France increased the risk of being cut off and destroyed by superior French forces. Philip VI understood this vulnerability and began concentrating his available troops to intercept the English before they could return safely to their ships. The tactical situation that developed as Edward approached the Somme River represented the kind of crisis that separated competent generals from truly great ones. The English king found himself trapped between an impassable river obstacle and a rapidly approaching French army that outnumbered his forces by at least 2 to 1. Traditional military wisdom suggested that his best option was to seek negotiation or attempt a desperate river crossing under cover of darkness. Instead, Edward chose to stand and fight at Crécy, selecting a defensive position that maximized his army's tactical advantages while minimizing the numerical superiority of his enemies. The battlefield he chose featured a gentle slope that would canalize French attacks while providing excellent fields of fire for his archers. More importantly, the position allowed Edward to deploy his forces according to the innovative tactical system he had been developing since his early Scottish campaigns. The English battle formation at Crécy represented the culmination of decades of tactical experimentation and refinement. The army was deployed in 3 battles or divisions, each combining archers and men-at-arms in mutually supporting roles. The archers were positioned to create interlocking fields of fire that would subject attacking enemies to continuous missile bombardment, while the men-at-arms provided close combat capability to exploit the disruption caused by archery. This tactical system represented a fundamental departure from the chivalric tradition that had dominated European warfare since the age of Charlemagne. Rather than viewing battle as an opportunity for individual knights to display personal prowess, Edward approached warfare as a problem requiring systematic solutions and coordinated effort. The subordination of aristocratic honor to tactical efficiency marked a revolutionary change in military thinking that would influence warfare for centuries to come. The French army that approached Crécy on the afternoon of August 26, 1346, represented the finest chivalric tradition of medieval Europe. Philip VI commanded a force that included the flower of French nobility, supported by Genoese crossbowmen and German mercenaries, whose reputation for military effectiveness was well established. Contemporary estimates suggest that the French enjoyed a numerical advantage of at least 3-1, creating reasonable expectations of victory despite Edward's tactical innovations. Philip VI's decision to attack immediately upon arriving at Crécy, rather than waiting for proper tactical deployment, reflected both the chivalric ethos that governed French military culture and the practical difficulties of maintaining discipline among noble contingents eager for glory. The French king found himself under enormous pressure from his subordinates to begin the battle before Edward could escape under cover of darkness. The opening phase of the Battle of Crécy demonstrated the obsolescence of traditional siege warfare when confronted by English tactical innovations. The Genoese crossbowmen, who had earned fearsome reputations in Italian conflicts, found themselves completely outclassed by English longbowmen, whose rate of fire and range of engagement exceeded anything they had previously encountered. The failure of the crossbow attack left the French cavalry exposed to concentrated archery without adequate missile support. The destruction of the French cavalry charges that followed represented one of the most complete tactical disasters in medieval military history. Wave after wave of heavily armored knights found themselves subjected to devastating archery fire that killed their horses, wounded their riders, and created chaos in their ranks before they could close with their enemies. Those few who managed to reach the English lines encountered disciplined formations of men-at-arms who fought on foot with weapons specifically chosen for close combat. Contemporary accounts of the battle emphasize the systematic efficiency with which the English forces destroyed their enemies. Rather than the confused melee that characterized most medieval battles, Crécy witnessed the methodical application of superior firepower and tactical discipline. English archers reportedly shot so many arrows that the sky was darkened, while their targets fell in such numbers that the battlefield became carpeted with noble corpses. The death of King John of Bohemia at Crécy became legendary throughout Europe as an example of chivalric courage in the face of hopeless odds. The blind king, led into battle by his retainers with their bridle reins tied together, charged into the English lines knowing that death was certain, but honor demanded the attempt. His fate, along with that of the countless other nobles who died in the battle, symbolized both the glory and the futility of traditional knightly warfare. The young Prince Edward's conduct during his first major battle earned him recognition as a warrior worthy of his father's reputation. Contemporary accounts describe the 16-year-old prince fighting in the thick of the combat, wielding his weapons with deadly skill, while maintaining the composure necessary for effective command. His performance at Crécy marked the beginning of a military career that would make him one of the most feared commanders of his generation. The aftermath of Crécy revealed the strategic as well as tactical implications of Edward's victory. The flower of French chivalry lay dead on the field, including many of the kingdom's most experienced military leaders. Philip VI himself had barely escaped with his life. While his army had been so completely destroyed, that organised resistance to English operations became temporarily impossible. The psychological impact of such a complete disaster would influence French military thinking for the remainder of the war. Edward's decision not to pursue the defeated French forces demonstrated both strategic wisdom and practical limitations. His army had been severely depleted by the campaign and the battle, while the approach of winter made extended operations increasingly hazardous. More importantly, the English king understood that his real strategic objective was not the destruction of French armies, but the acquisition of territorial conquests that would strengthen England's negotiating position. The siege of Calais that followed Crécy represented Edward's most ambitious undertaking of the entire war and his greatest strategic success. The capture of this fortress city would provide England with a permanent base on the continent, a secure port for future expeditions, and a powerful symbol of English determination to maintain their French claims regardless of cost or opposition. The investment of Calais, beginning in September 1346, demonstrated Edward's understanding that medieval siege warfare required resources and patience on a scale that dwarfed even the largest field campaigns. The English king assembled one of the largest armies of his reign, numbering over 32,000 men, and prepared for a siege that would last 11 months and consume enormous quantities of supplies, equipment, and money. Edward's conduct of the siege revealed both his mastery of military logistics and his sophisticated understanding of siegecraft. Rather than attempting to storm the city's formidable defences, he chose to surround Calais completely and starve the garrison into submission. This strategy required the construction of an entire temporary city outside Calais' walls, complete with permanent buildings, streets, and even markets, where English merchants could trade with the army. The French attempts to relieve Calais demonstrated both Philip VI's determination to reverse his military disasters and the limitations imposed by the defeat at Crécy. Several French expeditions approached the city during the course of the siege, but none proved strong enough to challenge Edward's position or break through his lines of circumvallation. The destruction of French military leadership at Crécy had created a power vacuum that could not be filled quickly enough to save the besieged city. The surrender of Calais in August 1347 marked the culmination of Edward's most successful military campaign and provided him with his greatest strategic triumph. The terms imposed upon the defeated city were harsh by any standard, reflecting both Edward's determination to make an example of French resistance and his need to recoup some of the enormous costs of the siege. The expulsion of the French population and their replacement by English colonists created a secure base for future operations while symbolizing the permanence of English conquest. The famous episode of the 6 burghers of Calais, who offered their lives to save their fellow citizens from Edward's wrath, provided the king with an opportunity to display both royal justice and royal mercy. The theatrical nature of this episode, the condemned burghers appearing in their shirts with ropes around their necks, Queen Philippa's dramatic intercession, and Edward's subsequent clemency, suggests careful orchestration designed to enhance the king's reputation while achieving practical political objectives. The capture of Calais coincided with another English triumph that demonstrated the comprehensive nature of Edward's military success. The Battle of Neville's Cross on October 17, 1346, saw English forces defeat and capture David II of Scotland, effectively eliminating the northern threat that had plagued England for decades. This victory, achieved while Edward was conducting the siege of Calais, showed the growing depth of English military capabilities and the effectiveness of the king's strategic coordination. The defeat and capture of the Scottish king represented the complete reversal of the disasters that had characterized Anglo-Scottish relations since the reign of Edward II. David II's invasion of northern England had been timed to coincide with Edward's continental campaign, reflecting the continuing alliance between France and Scotland. Yet the Scottish king's forces proved no more capable of resisting English tactical innovations than their French allies had been at Crécy. The impact of these victories extended far beyond their immediate military consequences. Edward III had demonstrated that English arms could triumph over the greatest powers in Europe when properly led and efficiently organized. The prestige gained through these successes enhanced England's diplomatic position, while attracting ambitious warriors from across Europe to serve in Edward's armies. The Order of the Garter, founded by Edward around 1348, represented both the culmination of his military successes and his understanding of the importance of ceremonial magnificence in maintaining royal authority. This new chivalric order provided institutional expression for the martial values that had brought England such spectacular success, while creating bonds of loyalty between the king and his most important followers. The Garter represented Edward's conscious attempt to create an Arthurian fellowship that would embody the highest ideals of Christian knighthood while serving practical political purposes. The limited membership of 26 knights ensured exclusivity, while the elaborate ceremonies and rich endowments made membership highly desirable. The order's motto, Honi soit qui mal y pense, shame on him who thinks evil of it, reflected both Edward's confidence in his cause and his defiance of those who questioned his methods. Edward's court during the late 1340s became the centre of European chivalric culture, attracting visitors from across the continent who came to witness the spectacle of English triumph and perhaps gain some share in Edward's legendary success. The tournaments and celebrations held at Windsor Castle created a magnificent setting for the display of royal power, while providing practical training for the warfare that had brought such glory to English arms. The reconstruction of Windsor Castle during this period represented Edward's commitment to creating a physical monument worthy of his achievements. The enormous sums expended on this project, estimated at over £50,000, equivalent to several years of royal income, demonstrated both the wealth generated by military success and the king's understanding of the importance of ceremonial magnificence in maintaining royal authority. Yet beneath the glittering surface of triumph lay growing concerns about the sustainability of Edward's military achievements. The costs of the Crécy campaign and the Calais siege had nearly bankrupted the English treasury, while the manpower requirements of maintaining continental conquests threatened to exhaust England's limited population. The Black Death, which struck England in 1348-49, would soon reveal the fragility of the foundations upon which Edward's success had been built. The plague's arrival in England during the height of Edward's military triumph provided a grim reminder of the limitations of human ambition in the face of natural catastrophe. Contemporary estimates suggest that the Black Death killed between 1/3 and 1/2 of England's population, creating demographic and economic disruption that would influence the kingdom's development for centuries to come. The disease's impact on France was even more severe, fundamentally altering the balance of power between the two kingdoms. Edward's response to the plague demonstrated both his practical intelligence and his understanding of royal responsibility during times of crisis. Rather than abandoning his continental ambitions, the king adapted his strategies to accommodate the changed circumstances while maintaining pressure on his French enemies. The reduced availability of manpower forced greater reliance on tactical innovation and strategic efficiency, ultimately making English military operations even more devastating in their effects. By 1350, Edward III had established himself as the dominant figure in European politics and the most successful military commander of his generation. His victories at Crécy and the capture of Calais had demonstrated English military superiority in the most decisive terms possible, while the defeat of Scotland had secured England's northern border for the first time in living memory. The foundations had been laid for even greater triumphs that would cement Edward's reputation as one of history's greatest warrior kings. Yet the king had also learned harsh lessons about the costs of military glory and the challenges of maintaining continental empire with limited English resources. These concerns would influence his approach to the next phase of the war, as he sought to capitalize on his achievements while avoiding the overextension that had destroyed so many previous English attempts at continental conquest. The decade of the 1350s opened with Edward III at the height of his power and prestige, master of a continental empire that stretched from Calais to the Pyrenees and ruler of a kingdom whose military prowess had become legendary throughout Europe. Yet this period would prove to be one of the most challenging in his reign, testing his strategic wisdom and political judgment as external pressures and domestic crises threatened to undermine the foundations of his success. The Black Death's devastating impact on both England and France had fundamentally altered the context in which the war was being fought. The massive population losses suffered by both kingdoms created new constraints on military operations while generating social and economic disruption that challenged traditional forms of royal authority. Edward's response to these challenges demonstrated both his adaptability as a strategist and his growing sophistication as a political leader. The resumption of large-scale military operations in 1355 marked Edward's determination to capitalize on his earlier successes despite the changed circumstances created by the plague. The king's decision to launch coordinated campaigns from both Calais and Gascony reflected his understanding that English strategic advantages lay in mobility and tactical superiority, rather than the ability to maintain large occupying forces across extensive territories. The campaign leadership Edward chose for these renewed operations revealed his confidence in the military talents of his family and his closest associates. His eldest son Edward, now known as the Black Prince, had proven his worth at Crécy and in subsequent operations, demonstrating not only personal courage, but also the strategic intelligence necessary for independent command. At 25 years of age, the prince represented the next generation of English military leadership, while embodying the chivalric ideals that had become associated with English martial success. Henry of Lancaster, now Duke of Lancaster following his father's death, provided Edward with another proven commander whose experience and reputation complemented the prince's youth and energy. Lancaster's victories at Oberroche and other engagements had established him as one of England's most capable generals, while his political weight helped maintain noble support for the king's increasingly expensive military policies. The Black Prince's expedition from Bordeaux in October 1355 inaugurated what would become known as the Grand Chevauchée, a destructive march through southern France that combined military objectives with economic warfare on an unprecedented scale. The prince's army, numbering approximately 4,000 men, was relatively small by the standards of Edward's earlier campaigns, yet its impact would prove disproportionate to its size due to the innovative tactics and strategic approach employed by its commander. The concept of chevauchée represented a sophisticated understanding of medieval warfare that went far beyond simple raiding or territorial conquest. By systematically destroying French economic resources while avoiding costly sieges and pitched battles, the Black Prince could achieve strategic objectives with limited forces while generating the plunder necessary to sustain his operations. This approach maximized English advantages in mobility and tactical efficiency, while minimizing exposure to French numerical superiority. The prince's march through Languedoc demonstrated both the destructive potential of this strategy and its limitations as a tool of long-term conquest. Cities like Carcassonne, Narbonne, and countless smaller towns suffered devastating attacks that left them economically crippled for years to come. Yet the temporary nature of these successes meant that French resistance could recover once English forces moved on, requiring constant repetition of destructive campaigns to maintain strategic pressure. The political impact of the Black Prince's operations extended far beyond their immediate military consequences. The systematic devastation of some of France's richest provinces demonstrated the inability of Philip VI's government to protect its subjects from English aggression. This failure of royal protection undermined the fundamental compact between ruler and rule that formed the basis of medieval monarchy, creating political instability that complemented the economic damage inflicted by English arms. French attempts to counter English chevauchée tactics revealed both the strengths and limitations of traditional medieval military organization. Philip VI's forces proved capable of shadowing English expeditions and harassing isolated detachments, but they struggled to force decisive engagements when English commanders chose to avoid battle. The tactical advantages demonstrated at Crécy made French generals reluctant to risk pitched battles unless circumstances were heavily in their favor. The death of Philip VI in August 1350 and the succession of his son John II created new opportunities and challenges for English strategy. The new French king inherited both his father's financial difficulties and the military problems created by a decade of English successes, yet he also brought different personality traits and strategic approaches to the continuing conflict. John II, known to history as John the Good, possessed the physical courage and chivalric ideals that made him popular among the French nobility, yet he lacked the political sophistication and strategic patience necessary for effective leadership during a prolonged war. His preference for aggressive action over careful planning would ultimately provide Edward and the Black Prince with opportunities for even greater victories than those achieved against his father. The resumption of major English operations in 1356 coincided with French attempts to regain the initiative through coordinated campaigns designed to trap and destroy English forces operating in central France. John II's strategic plan showed considerable sophistication, involving multiple French armies converging on English positions from different directions while using superior numbers to force the kind of decisive battle that French commanders had been avoiding since Crécy. The Black Prince's campaign of 1356 began as another grand chevauchée from Bordeaux, following the pattern established in his successful expedition of the previous year. Yet this operation would prove fundamentally different in its consequences, as the prince found himself drawn into the kind of major engagement that English strategy had generally sought to avoid. The transformation of a routine raiding expedition into one of the most decisive battles of the entire war demonstrated both the unpredictable nature of medieval warfare and the extraordinary tactical skill of Edward's eldest son. The prince's army, as it departed Bordeaux in August 1356, represented the cream of English military capability, a perfectly balanced force that combined the firepower of veteran longbowmen with the shock action of experienced men-at-arms, numbering approximately 6,000 to 7,000 men. This army was smaller than the forces Edward had deployed in his earlier campaigns, yet it possessed a level of tactical sophistication and battlefield experience that made it extraordinarily effective for its size. The composition of the Black Prince's force reflected the evolution of English military organization under his father's leadership. Professional soldiers bound by contracts of service had largely replaced the traditional feudal levies that had characterized earlier armies, while the integration of different military specialties had reached unprecedented levels of efficiency. The prince's Gascon allies, led by the formidable Jean III de Grailly, Captal de Buch, provided local knowledge and additional tactical capabilities that enhanced the army's operational flexibility. The march northward from Bordeaux demonstrated the Black Prince's mastery of the chevauchée technique that had brought his father such success. Town after town fell to English attack or paid tribute to avoid destruction, while the systematic burning of crops and slaughter of livestock created economic devastation that would persist long after the army had moved on. Yet this destructive progress also drew the prince deeper into French territory, farther from his bases of supply and closer to the converging French armies that John II was assembling. The French king's strategic response to the English expedition showed both improved coordination compared to his father's efforts and continued commitment to the aggressive tactics that had proven so costly at Crécy. John II assembled multiple armies totaling perhaps 50,000 men, far larger than any force the Black Prince could hope to defeat in open battle. The French plan called for these armies to converge on the English force and compel the decisive engagement that had been avoided for the past decade. The tactical situation that developed near Poitiers in September 1356 appeared to offer John II everything he could have hoped for from his strategic planning. The Black Prince found his army intercepted by vastly superior French forces, cut off from retreat to Bordeaux, and facing the prospect of destruction or surrender. Traditional military analysis suggested that the English position was hopeless and that negotiation offered the only alternative to annihilation. Yet the Black Prince's response to this crisis demonstrated the tactical genius that he had inherited from his father, along with innovations that were distinctly his own. Rather than accepting defeat or seeking terms, the prince chose to fight on ground of his own selection, using tactical methods that maximized his army's advantages while minimizing the impact of French numerical superiority. The battlefield he selected near Maupertuis provided natural obstacles that would canalize French attacks while offering excellent defensive positions for English archers. The Battle of Poitiers on September 19, 1356, represented the culmination of English tactical development under Edward III and the complete vindication of the military revolution that had begun with the Scottish campaigns of the 1330s. The prince's deployment of his forces showed masterly understanding of combined arms tactics, with archers positioned to create interlocking fields of fire, while men-at-arms waited in carefully chosen positions to exploit the disruption caused by missile warfare. The opening phase of the battle demonstrated both the continued effectiveness of English archery and the inadequacy of French attempts to counter it. John II's forces included substantial numbers of crossbowmen and other missile troops, yet these proved completely outclassed by English longbowmen, whose rate of fire, accuracy, and range of engagement exceeded anything the French could deploy. The failure of French missile troops left their cavalry exposed to devastating archery without adequate covering fire. The destruction of the French cavalry charges that followed replicated the tactical pattern established at Crécy, but with even more devastating effectiveness. The constrained terrain chosen by the Black Prince prevented the French from deploying their numerical advantage effectively, forcing them to attack in successive waves that could be defeated in detail. Each French charge was subjected to concentrated archery fire that decimated both horses and riders before they could close with their enemies. The capture of King John II himself marked the climax of English tactical success and provided Edward III with his greatest diplomatic triumph. The spectacle of the French king being taken prisoner on the field of battle sent shockwaves throughout Europe, while demonstrating the complete collapse of French military effectiveness. No English victory since Hastings had achieved such symbolic significance or provided such concrete political advantages. The circumstances of John II's capture revealed both the chivalric ideals that continued to influence medieval warfare and the practical realities that determined battlefield outcomes. The French king's personal courage was beyond question as he fought in the thick of the battle, wielding his weapons with deadly skill and refusing opportunities to escape when his position became hopeless. Yet this individual heroism proved counterproductive when it resulted in the loss of royal leadership and the demoralization of French resistance. The Black Prince's treatment of his royal prisoner demonstrated both his understanding of chivalric courtesy and his appreciation of the political value of magnanimous behavior. The elaborate ceremonies conducted after the battle, with the prince personally serving John II at dinner and refusing to sit in the presence of his royal captive, created a powerful narrative of English honour that enhanced the moral authority of Edward's cause while providing practical benefits in terms of public relations. The immediate aftermath of Poitiers revealed the comprehensive nature of French defeat and the extraordinary scope of English success. In addition to King John II, the prisoners taken by the Black Prince's army included 17 counts, 66 barons, and over 2,000 knights and men-at-arms. This represented a significant portion of French military leadership, creating a power vacuum that would influence French politics for years to come. The strategic implications of the victory at Poitiers extended far beyond its immediate military consequences. The capture of the French king effectively paralyzed royal government and created opportunities for English diplomacy that had not existed since the beginning of the war. Edward III now possessed the ultimate bargaining counter in his negotiations with France, while French resistance was severely compromised by the loss of legitimate royal authority. The ransom negotiations that followed Poitiers demonstrated Edward's sophisticated understanding of the relationship between military success and diplomatic advantage. Rather than seeking merely financial compensation for John II's release, the English king used his prisoner's desperate situation to extract territorial concessions that would have been impossible to achieve through military conquest alone. The proposed terms would have granted England sovereignty over vast areas of southwestern France, while requiring French recognition of English claims to territories lost centuries earlier. The Treaty of London, concluded in 1359, represented the high watermark of English diplomatic success during the 100 Years' War. The territorial concessions demanded by Edward would have restored something approaching the old Angevin Empire, while requiring France to pay an enormous ransom for their king's release. Yet the very scope of these demands created political problems within France that ultimately made implementation impossible. The French Estates General's rejection of the Treaty of London demonstrated both the limitations of royal authority in medieval politics and the growing strength of French national consciousness. Despite John II's personal commitment to the agreement, his subjects proved unwilling to accept terms that would have effectively dismembered the French kingdom. This rejection forced Edward to resume military operations designed to compel French acceptance of his demands through continued application of military pressure. The Reims campaign of 1359 to 1360 marked Edward III's final attempt to secure the French crown through military conquest rather than diplomatic negotiation. The English king assembled what may have been the largest army of his entire reign, including substantial numbers of foreign mercenaries, along with the usual English and Gascon contingents. This massive force was intended to demonstrate English power, while providing the military capability necessary to reduce French resistance through systematic devastation. Edward's march through Champagne toward the traditional coronation city of Reims represented both the logical culmination of his French claims and a fundamental misunderstanding of the political situation he was attempting to resolve. The symbolic importance of Reims as the site where French kings received their sacred anointing made it a natural target for Edward's ambitions, yet the city's defences and the determination of its inhabitants made capture extremely difficult. The siege of Reims revealed both the strengths and limitations of Edward's military capabilities after 2 decades of continental warfare. English siege techniques had improved considerably since the early campaigns of the 1340s, incorporating innovations in artillery and engineering that made traditional fortifications increasingly vulnerable. Yet the city's substantial garrison and the approach of winter created logistical challenges that even Edward's sophisticated supply organization struggled to overcome. The failure to capture Reims marked a turning point in Edward's French ambitions and the beginning of a more realistic approach to Anglo-French relations. The king's inability to reduce such an important symbolic target demonstrated the limitations of English military power when confronted with determined resistance and adequate preparation. More importantly, the enormous costs of the campaign were straining English resources to the breaking point while producing diminishing returns in terms of strategic advantage. The mysterious incident known as Black Monday, which occurred near Chartres on April 13, 1360, provided Edward with a face-saving opportunity to abandon his increasingly unsuccessful campaign. Contemporary accounts describe a devastating hailstorm that struck the English army with unprecedented fury, killing men and horses while destroying equipment and supplies. Whether this was truly a natural disaster or a convenient excuse for retreat, the incident allowed Edward to seek negotiated settlement without appearing to admit military failure. The Treaty of Bretigny, concluded on May 8, 1360, represented a triumph of diplomatic realism over dynastic ambition that would define the remainder of Edward's reign. Rather than continuing to pursue the impossible goal of complete French submission, the English king accepted terms that granted him substantial territorial gains, while requiring him to abandon his claim to the French crown. This compromise satisfied English strategic objectives, while providing France with relief from the existential threat posed by Edward's dynastic pretensions. The territorial provisions of Bretigny were extraordinarily favourable to English interests, granting Edward sovereignty over Aquitaine, Gascony, Calais, and numerous other territories that together comprised approximately one-third of France. These concessions represented the greatest English territorial gains since the Norman conquest, while providing secure bases for future operations should the peace prove temporary. More importantly, the territories granted to Edward were held in full sovereignty rather than feudal dependence, eliminating the jurisdictional problems that had contributed to earlier conflicts. The financial terms of the treaty were equally advantageous to English interests, requiring France to pay a ransom of 3 million gold crowns for John II's release, while providing interim hostages to guarantee payment. This enormous sum represented several years of French royal income and would provide Edward with the resources necessary to maintain his enlarged continental possessions while rebuilding English military capabilities. Edward's renunciation of his claim to the French crown marked the end of the most ambitious phase of his continental policy, while opening possibilities for more stable Anglo-French relations. This concession was painful for the English king, representing, as it did, the abandonment of dynastic goals that had justified 2 decades of expensive warfare. Yet the practical advantages gained through the treaty more than compensated for this symbolic loss, providing England with concrete territorial and financial benefits that enhanced royal power more effectively than empty titular claims. The implementation of Bretigny's provisions demonstrated both the genuine desire for peace shared by war-weary populations in both kingdoms and the practical difficulties involved in transforming military conquest into stable political settlement. The transfer of territorial sovereignty required complex administrative arrangements, while the collection and payment of John II's ransom involved financial mechanisms that strained the resources of both governments. John II's return to France in October 1360 marked the official end of his 4-year captivity and provided opportunities for both kingdoms to begin the difficult process of reconstruction after decades of devastating warfare. Yet the French king's freedom was conditional upon the fulfillment of treaty obligations that would prove difficult to implement in practice. The political and financial weaknesses that had made France vulnerable to English attack remained largely unchanged, creating ongoing instability that threatened the durability of the peace settlement. Edward's establishment of the Black Prince as Prince of Aquitaine in 1362 represented both a practical solution to the problem of governing his enlarged French possessions and a symbolic recognition of his son's military achievements. The creation of this autonomous principality allowed the English crown to maintain control over its continental territories while providing the prince with an appropriate sphere for his talents and ambitions. Yet this arrangement also created new potential sources of conflict, as the prince's policies in Aquitaine would ultimately contribute to the renewal of Anglo-French warfare. The Treaty of Bretigny marked the end of the first and most successful phase of Edward III's French wars, while establishing the territorial and political framework that would influence Anglo-French relations for the remainder of the medieval period. Edward had achieved military victories that surpassed even the most optimistic expectations, while securing diplomatic gains that enhanced English power more substantially than any monarch since William the Conqueror. Yet these triumphs had come at enormous cost in resources and lives, while creating precedents for total warfare that would ultimately consume both kingdoms in centuries of devastating conflict. The decade of the 1350s had seen Edward III reach the pinnacle of his military and political career, achieving successes that established him as one of the greatest warrior kings in European history. The combination of tactical innovation, strategic sophistication, and diplomatic skill that had characterized his approach to the French wars had produced results that exceeded all reasonable expectations, while creating a legend of English military supremacy that would influence European politics for centuries to come. Yet even at the moment of his greatest triumph, the seeds of future difficulties were already apparent. The enormous costs of continental warfare had strained English resources, while the demographic impact of the Black Death had reduced the manpower available for future campaigns. The territorial gains secured at Bretigny would prove difficult to hold and administer, while the fundamental causes of Anglo-French conflict remained unresolved beneath the surface of diplomatic accommodation. The peaceful interlude that followed the Treaty of Bretigny provided Edward III with unprecedented opportunities to demonstrate his capabilities as a domestic ruler and institutional innovator. The king, who had earned fame through military conquest, now turned his considerable talents toward the arts of peace, creating legal and governmental frameworks that would influence English development long after his territorial conquests had been lost. These years of domestic achievement would prove as significant for Edward's historical legacy as his more celebrated military triumphs. The financial challenges created by decades of continental warfare had forced Edward to develop new approaches to royal administration that balanced the crown's fiscal needs with the political rights of his subjects. The enormous costs of maintaining English possessions in France, while conducting periodic campaigns against French resistance, required sustainable sources of revenue that could only be secured through parliamentary cooperation. Edward's success in managing these relationships established precedents for royal parliamentary interaction that would influence English constitutional development for centuries. The evolution of Parliament during Edward's reign reflected both the practical necessities created by military financing and the king's sophisticated understanding of the political benefits that could be gained through constitutional innovation. Rather than viewing parliamentary institutions as obstacles to royal authority, Edward came to see them as partners in governance whose cooperation enhanced rather than diminished royal power. This collaborative approach represented a fundamental shift from the adversarial relationship that had characterized his father's reign. The development of the House of Commons as a genuine partner in governance marked one of the most significant constitutional innovations of Edward's domestic policy. The representatives of shires and boroughs who gathered at Westminster were no longer merely consulted on royal proposals, but became active participants in the legislative process, contributing both financial support and political legitimacy to royal policies. Their growing influence reflected both their importance as sources of taxation and their value as conduits for royal communication with local communities. Edward's approach to parliamentary taxation demonstrated his understanding that sustainable financial policies required genuine consent, rather than grudging compliance extracted through royal pressure. The principle that extraordinary taxation required parliamentary approval was firmly established during his reign, yet this constraint was balanced by parliamentary willingness to grant such approval when the king could demonstrate genuine necessity and responsible stewardship of public resources. The introduction of new forms of indirect taxation during Edward's reign provided the Crown with more flexible and politically acceptable sources of revenue than the traditional direct levies that had been the mainstay of royal finance. The wool subsidy and other commercial taxes generated substantial income while distributing the tax burden more broadly across the population. These innovations demonstrated Edward's recognition that effective taxation required adaptation to changing economic conditions and social structures. The Statute of Labourers, enacted in 1351, represented Edward's attempt to address the social and economic disruption created by the Black Death, while maintaining the stability necessary for continued military success. The massive population losses caused by the plague had created severe labour shortages that threatened to undermine traditional social relationships through rapid wage increases and unprecedented worker mobility. Edward's legislation sought to preserve existing social structures by fixing wages and restricting worker movement. Yet the implementation of the Statute of Labourers revealed both the limitations of royal authority and the irreversible nature of the social changes unleashed by demographic catastrophe. Despite vigorous enforcement efforts, market forces proved stronger than legal constraints, and wages continued to rise while workers continued to migrate in search of better opportunities. The statute's ultimate failure demonstrated that even successful monarchs could not entirely control the social and economic forces reshaping medieval society. The legal reforms implemented during Edward's reign extended far beyond emergency measures designed to address immediate crises. The expansion of the justices of the peace system created new mechanisms for maintaining local order while reducing the burden on central royal courts. These local magistrates, drawn from the lesser nobility and urban elites, provided accessible justice while serving as agents of royal authority in their communities. The development of new legal procedures and expanded jurisdictions during Edward's reign reflected both the growing complexity of medieval society and the Crown's increasing administrative sophistication. The creation of specialized courts and the elaboration of legal precedents provided more efficient mechanisms for resolving disputes, while generating additional sources of royal revenue through fees and fines. These innovations enhanced royal authority while providing subjects with improved access to justice. Edward's cultural patronage during the peaceful years following Bretigny demonstrated his understanding that royal magnificence required more than military success alone. The reconstruction of Windsor Castle created one of medieval Europe's most impressive royal residences, while providing a suitable setting for the ceremonial activities that reinforced royal authority. The enormous sums expended on this project reflected both the wealth generated by military success and the king's commitment to creating physical monuments worthy of his achievements. The establishment of St. George's Chapel at Windsor provided an appropriate setting for the order of the Garter, while demonstrating Edward's commitment to the religious obligations of Christian kingship. The elaborate ceremonies conducted at Windsor combined elements of traditional monarchy with the new chivalric ideals that had emerged from Edward's military success, creating a unique synthesis that influenced European courtly culture for centuries. The literary and intellectual developments that flourished during Edward's reign reflected both royal patronage and the broader cultural changes generated by English military success. The emergence of English as a literary language of serious artistic achievement marked a significant departure from the French-dominated culture that had characterized the English court since the Norman conquest. Works like Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, and the early poems of Geoffrey Chaucer demonstrated the growing sophistication of English literary culture. The increasing use of English in official documents and legal proceedings during Edward's reign reflected both practical convenience and growing national consciousness. The Statute of Pleading, enacted in 1362, required English rather than French to be used in law courts, while parliamentary proceedings were increasingly conducted in the vernacular rather than Latin or French. These changes marked important steps in the development of English national identity, while reducing the influence of continental cultural models. Edward's religious policies during this period demonstrated his commitment to traditional Catholic orthodoxy, while asserting royal authority over ecclesiastical affairs. The Statutes of Provisors and Praemunire, enacted in 1351 and 1353, limited papal interference in English church appointments while asserting royal rights over ecclesiastical revenues. These measures reflected both financial necessity and growing national sentiment against foreign ecclesiastical control. The king's personal religious observances provided models of piety that reinforced royal authority while demonstrating his commitment to Christian kingship. Edward's pilgrimages, charitable donations, and support for religious institutions created a public image of royal devotion that complemented his military reputation while appealing to subjects who valued traditional religious values. The economic policies implemented during Edward's domestic period demonstrated his understanding that military success required sustainable foundations in commercial prosperity and agricultural productivity. The encouragement of wool production and textile manufacturing provided England with competitive advantages in international trade, while generating the revenues necessary to support continental military operations. The development of English commercial law and trading privileges created frameworks that would support economic growth for centuries. The reorganization of royal administration during the 1360s reflected lessons learned from decades of military campaigning and continental governance. The development of more efficient bureaucratic procedures and clearer lines of administrative authority enhanced royal effectiveness while reducing the costs of government operations. These reforms provided models for efficient administration that influenced governmental development throughout the later medieval period. Edward's approach to noble relationships during these peaceful years demonstrated his sophisticated understanding of the delicate balance required to maintain aristocratic support while preserving royal authority. The continued creation of new titles and the distribution of lands and offices provided opportunities for advancement while ensuring that noble interests remained aligned with royal policies. The king's success in maintaining noble loyalty without compromising royal prerogatives represented one of his most significant political achievements. The development of new military technologies during the 1360s reflected Edward's continued commitment to maintaining English tactical advantages over potential enemies. The improvement of artillery and the refinement of archery techniques ensured that English forces would remain competitive, even as other European powers adopted similar military innovations. Investment in military research and development demonstrated the king's understanding that past success could not guarantee future victory without continued adaptation and improvement. The diplomatic initiatives undertaken during this period reflected Edward's recognition that military conquest required political consolidation to achieve lasting success. The network of alliances and trading relationships developed during the 1360s provided England with continental partners while creating mechanisms for maintaining English influence without the enormous costs of continuous military operations. Edward's treatment of his enlarged continental possessions demonstrated both his commitment to responsible governance and his understanding of the challenges involved in ruling diverse populations with different legal traditions and political expectations. The establishment of efficient administrative systems in Aquitaine and other territories provided models for colonial governance while generating the revenues necessary to maintain English military presence. The king's family relationships during this period reflected both his personal affections and his strategic understanding of the importance of dynastic stability. The marriages arranged for his children created alliances with important European families while ensuring the continuation of Plantagenet bloodlines. Edward's obvious devotion to Queen Philippa provided a model of royal matrimony that enhanced his reputation for honourable behaviour. The cultural synthesis achieved at Edward's court during the 1360s represented the culmination of decades of military success and political innovation. The combination of English, French, and international elements created a unique courtly culture that influenced European aristocratic behaviour for generations. The chivalric ideals developed at Windsor provided models for noble conduct that spread throughout Europe while reinforcing English prestige and influence. The intellectual developments that flourished under Edward's patronage reflected both royal encouragement and the broader cultural confidence generated by military success. The establishment of new educational institutions and the support for scholarly activities created foundations for intellectual advancement, while demonstrating royal commitment to learning and cultural development. The architectural achievements of Edward's reign, exemplified by the reconstruction of Windsor Castle and the establishment of numerous other building projects, created physical monuments to royal success, while providing economic stimulus to local communities. The sophisticated building techniques and artistic innovations displayed in these projects demonstrated English technical capabilities while creating models that influenced architectural development throughout Europe. Edward's legal legacy extended beyond specific statutes and administrative reforms to encompass fundamental changes in the relationship between royal authority and subject rights. The precedents established during his reign regarding parliamentary consent, legal procedure, and administrative responsibility created constitutional frameworks that would influence English political development for centuries. The balance achieved between royal prerogative and subject rights provided models that would be studied and emulated throughout Europe. By 1369, when the peaceful interlude established by the Treaty of Bretigny began to collapse, Edward III had demonstrated that his talents extended far beyond military leadership to encompass the full range of royal responsibilities. The domestic achievements of the 1360s established foundations for English institutional development that would outlast his military conquests, while providing the administrative and financial capabilities necessary for the renewed warfare that would characterize the remainder of his reign. The king, who had earned fame through victory at Crécy and the capture of King John II, had proven equally capable of managing the complex challenges of domestic governance during times of peace. Yet these achievements in law, administration, and cultural development would soon be tested by the renewal of French warfare and the domestic challenges that would characterize the final phase of Edward's long and eventful reign. The gathering storm, resumption of war, and French recovery. The collapse of the Bretigny settlement in 1369 marked the end of Edward III's greatest diplomatic triumph and the beginning of a new phase of the 100 Years' War that would test the aging king's strategic wisdom and political resilience. The renewal of hostilities came not through dramatic military confrontation, but through the gradual erosion of the legal and political foundations that had supported the English position in France. Edward, now 57 years old and showing signs of the physical decline that would characterize his final years, faced challenges that would have daunted him even in his prime. The immediate cause of renewed warfare lay in the complex political situation that had developed in Castile, where a civil war between King Peter the Cruel and his half-brother Henry of Trastamara provided opportunities for both English and French intervention. The Black Prince's decision to support Peter's restoration, while strategically sound in theory, would prove to be a catastrophic miscalculation that undermined English finances and provided Charles V of France with the pretext needed to resume hostilities. Charles V, who had assumed the French throne in 1364, represented a fundamentally different challenge from his father John II, where John had been a chivalric warrior whose courage exceeded his strategic judgment. Charles possessed the intellectual sophistication and patient calculation necessary for long-term political success. His approach to warfare emphasized systematic preparation, financial stability, and the careful exploitation of English weaknesses, rather than the dramatic gestures that had characterized earlier French efforts. The new French king's strategic vision encompassed both military and political dimensions, recognizing that English power in France ultimately depended on local acceptance and economic sustainability, rather than mere military conquest. Charles's policies were designed to undermine these foundations through a combination of diplomatic pressure, economic warfare, and carefully orchestrated rebellions that would make continued English occupation increasingly expensive and politically untenable. The appointment of Bertrand du Guesclin as Constable of France provided Charles V with a military commander whose tactical approach perfectly complemented royal strategy. Du Guesclin, a Breton knight of relatively humble origins, had earned his reputation through guerrilla warfare and irregular tactics that avoided the kind of pitched battles where English tactical superiority had proven so devastating. His elevation to supreme military command marked a fundamental shift in French military thinking, away from chivalric ideals toward pragmatic effectiveness. The Black Prince's expedition into Castile in 1367 achieved its immediate objective of restoring Peter the Cruel to his throne, yet the costs of this success would prove ruinous to English interests in Aquitaine. The campaign consumed enormous financial resources while exposing English forces to diseases and hardships that decimated their effectiveness. More importantly, the prince's absence from Aquitaine provided opportunities for French-sponsored rebellions that would ultimately undermine English authority throughout their continental possessions. The victory at Nájera on April 3, 1367, marked the last great triumph of traditional English tactical methods and demonstrated that the military innovations developed under Edward III retained their effectiveness when properly applied. The Black Prince's army, though weakened by disease and desertion, proved capable of destroying a larger Franco-Castilian force through the same combination of archery and disciplined infantry that had brought victory at Crécy and Poitiers. Yet this tactical success masked strategic failure on a scale that would ultimately prove decisive. Peter the Cruel's inability or unwillingness to pay the expenses promised for English support left the Black Prince deeply in debt, while his forces remained committed to maintaining an unpopular regime in hostile territory. The prince's deteriorating health, possibly caused by dysentery, contracted during the campaign, further compromised English military capabilities. The financial crisis created by the Castilian expedition forced the Black Prince to impose new taxation on his Aquitanian subjects, providing Charles V with the legal pretext needed to resume the French war. The hearth tax levied to pay English debts violated the traditional fiscal privileges that had made English rule acceptable to Gascon nobles, creating grievances that French diplomacy could exploit with devastating effectiveness. The appeal lodged by Gascon nobles to Charles V in his capacity as overlord of Aquitaine represented a masterpiece of legal and political manipulation that transformed English territorial gains into diplomatic disasters. By accepting this appeal, the French king could claim that he was merely exercising legitimate feudal jurisdiction rather than engaging in unprovoked aggression. This legal fiction provided sufficient justification for military action, while placing the English in the politically disadvantageous position of appearing to resist legitimate authority. Edward III's response to the French challenge demonstrated both his continued strategic acumen and the limitations imposed by age and changing circumstances. The elderly king's declaration that he would appear before the Paris Parlement with 60,000 men at his back recalled the defiant rhetoric of his youth. Yet the reality of English military capabilities in 1369 fell far short of such grandiose claims. The resumption of hostilities in 1369 revealed how completely the strategic situation had changed since the great English victories of the 1340 and 1350. French military organization had been fundamentally reformed under Charles V's direction, creating professional forces capable of avoiding the kind of devastating defeats that had characterized earlier phases of the war. The systematic training and disciplining of French troops, combined with improved fortification techniques and more sophisticated tactical doctrines, made English conquest far more difficult than it had been during Edward's earlier campaigns. Du Guesclin's approach to the renewed warfare demonstrated both the effectiveness of irregular tactics against English conventional forces and the strategic vision that made Charles V's recovery possible. Rather than seeking decisive battles that might result in catastrophic defeat, the French constable adopted a policy of systematic harassment designed to make English occupation increasingly expensive, while avoiding the risks associated with major engagements. The gradual loss of English territories in Aquitaine during the early 1370s reflected both French tactical innovations and the cumulative effects of decades of warfare on English resources and morale. Town after town submitted to French forces or changed sides through bribery and intimidation, while English garrisons found themselves increasingly isolated and unsupported. The systematic nature of these losses suggested coordinated French planning rather than random military success. John of Gaunt's expedition to France in 1373 represented Edward III's most ambitious attempt to reverse French gains through traditional English methods of mobile warfare and systematic devastation. The Duke's march from Calais to Bordeaux with an army of nearly 9,000 men demonstrated that England retained the capability for major military operations. Yet the expedition's ultimate failure revealed the limitations of these traditional approaches when confronted with French tactical adaptations. The French response to Gaunt's chevauchée showed how completely military thinking had evolved since the disasters of Crécy and Poitiers. Rather than attempting to intercept and destroy the English army in pitched battle, French forces shadowed the expedition while avoiding decisive engagement. This strategy allowed the French to inflict steady casualties through harassment and ambush, while forcing the English to consume their resources without achieving strategic objectives. The logistical difficulties encountered by Gaunt's expedition demonstrated both the sophistication of French defensive preparations and the increasing vulnerability of English armies operating deep in hostile territory. French scorched earth tactics denied English forces the local resources that had sustained earlier expeditions, while improved French intelligence networks provided advance warning of English movements. The combination of these factors made traditional chevauché warfare increasingly ineffective and prohibitively expensive. The condition of Gaunt's army when it finally reached Bordeaux at the end of 1373 revealed the human cost of strategic failure and tactical obsolescence. Contemporary accounts describe English forces reduced to less than half their original strength through disease, desertion, and combat losses, while the survivors were too exhausted and demoralized to undertake further operations. The Duke's inability to achieve any significant strategic objective, despite commanding one of the largest English armies of the decade, demonstrated the futility of continuing to rely on traditional military methods. The naval dimension of the renewed warfare proved equally disadvantageous to English interests, as French alliance with Castile provided access to naval resources that challenged English control of the Channel. The Franco-Castilian fleet's ability to raid English coastal towns while threatening communications with continental possessions created new strategic vulnerabilities that Edward's government struggled to address with limited resources. The defeat of an English fleet off La Rochelle in 1372 marked the beginning of French naval ascendancy that would persist for much of the remainder of the war. The loss of English naval supremacy compromised communications with Aquitaine, while making future military expeditions increasingly difficult and expensive. More importantly, the psychological impact of naval defeat undermined the confidence that had sustained English morale through earlier setbacks. The economic consequences of renewed warfare proved as damaging to English interests as the military defeats that characterized this period. The enormous costs of maintaining continental possessions while conducting periodic expeditions against French forces strained royal finances to the breaking point, forcing Edward to resort to increasingly unpopular taxation methods that generated domestic opposition. The combination of military failure and fiscal crisis created political challenges that would ultimately undermine royal authority. Edward's personal response to these multiplying crises demonstrated both his continued determination and the physical limitations that increasingly constrained his effectiveness. The aging king's attempts to direct military operations from England while dealing with domestic political opposition revealed the impossibility of maintaining the personal leadership that had been crucial to his earlier successes. The delegation of military authority to subordinates who lacked his tactical genius and political acumen contributed to the pattern of strategic failure that characterized this period. The Black Prince's return to England in 1371, broken in health and spirit by his failures in Aquitaine, symbolized the end of the military partnership that had brought England its greatest victories. The prince's obvious physical decline, combined with his political isolation resulting from the Aquitanian disasters, removed from English leadership the one commander whose tactical abilities approached those of his father. The prince's death in 1376 would eliminate the last hope for military recovery under experienced leadership. The diplomatic isolation that accompanied English military decline reflected both French success in building continental alliances and the declining attractiveness of English partnership for potential allies. The network of relationships that had supported Edward's earlier campaigns gradually dissolved as European powers calculated that French victory was increasingly probable. This diplomatic shift made English strategic recovery far more difficult, while providing France with additional resources for continued military pressure. The domestic impact of military failure became increasingly apparent as English nobles, who had grown wealthy through continental warfare, found their estates and revenue threatened by French recovery. The loss of Gascon territories eliminated important sources of aristocratic income, while the failure of military expeditions reduced opportunities for profitable plunder. These economic pressures created political discontent that would ultimately challenge royal authority and contribute to the constitutional crises of Edward's final years. The Truce of Bruges, concluded in 1375, represented Edward's tacit admission that military victory was no longer achievable through traditional English methods. The terms of this agreement implicitly recognized French recovery, while preserving only a fraction of the territorial gains that had been secured at Bretigny 15 years earlier. For a king whose reign had been defined by military triumph, this diplomatic retreat must have been profoundly demoralizing. The territorial situation at the time of the Bruges Truce revealed the comprehensive nature of French recovery and the failure of English attempts to maintain continental empire through military conquest alone. Of the vast territories granted to England at Bretigny, only Calais, Bordeaux, and a few isolated strongholds remained under English control. This dramatic reversal demonstrated both the effectiveness of Charles V's systematic approach to warfare and the limitations of English power when not supported by tactical surprise and superior military organization. Edward's physical and mental decline during the 1370s coincided with and perhaps contributed to the pattern of military and diplomatic failures that characterized this period. Contemporary observers noted the king's increasing absence from government and his apparent loss of the energy and decisiveness that had made him such an effective war leader. The burden of nearly half a century of kingship, combined with the stress of watching his life's work systematically dismantled, took an obvious toll on the aging monarch. The king's growing reliance on advisors and administrators reflected both his physical limitations and the increasing complexity of governing a kingdom faced with multiple simultaneous crises. Yet the quality of counsel available to Edward had declined significantly since the great days of the 1340s and 1350s, as death had claimed many of his most experienced and capable supporters. The loss of institutional memory and expertise contributed to the poor decision-making that characterized English policy during this period. The financial crisis that accompanied military failure created domestic political challenges that Edward's government proved increasingly unable to manage effectively. The enormous costs of maintaining continental possessions while conducting periodic military expeditions had exhausted traditional sources of royal revenue, forcing resort to new taxation methods that generated popular resentment and noble opposition. Parliamentary resistance to royal fiscal demands reflected both genuine concern about the sustainability of military expenditure and growing skepticism about the wisdom of continuing to pursue continental ambitions that appeared increasingly unrealistic. The House of Commons, which had generally supported Edward's military policies during the years of victory, became increasingly critical as the costs of warfare mounted, while strategic objectives remained unachieved. The social and economic disruption caused by decades of warfare had created domestic problems that required attention and resources that were being consumed by continental military operations. The demographic impact of the Black Death, combined with the economic distortions created by constant military mobilization, had fundamentally altered English society in ways that traditional royal policies struggled to address effectively. The aging of Edward's military leadership cadre created additional problems as the king found himself increasingly dependent on commanders who lacked the experience and tactical sophistication that had made English arms so successful during earlier phases of the war. The death or incapacitation of veteran leaders like Henry of Lancaster, the Black Prince, and other heroes of Crécy and Poitiers left gaps in military expertise that could not be filled quickly or easily. The development of new military technologies and tactical approaches by French and other continental armies reduced the advantages that had made English forces so dominant during the 1340 and 1350. The proliferation of firearms, improvements in fortification design, and innovations in siege warfare created new challenges that English military organization struggled to address with traditional methods and limited resources. The strategic implications of French recovery extended beyond the immediate military and territorial losses to encompass fundamental changes in the European balance of power. Charles V's success in rebuilding French military capabilities while maintaining domestic stability demonstrated that the period of French weakness that had created opportunities for English expansion was definitively over. The restoration of French power would influence European politics for centuries to come. Edward's attempts to address these mounting challenges through traditional military expeditions revealed both his continued faith in the methods that had brought earlier success and his inability to adapt to changing strategic circumstances. The king's commitment to continental warfare, despite its obvious futility, reflected both personal pride and institutional momentum that made strategic adjustment extremely difficult. The pattern of military failure, financial crisis, and domestic discontent that characterized the final years of Edward's active reign created precedents and expectations that would influence English politics long after his death. The constitutional and political challenges that emerged from these failures would contribute to the political instability that would plague England during the reign of his successor and ultimately lead to the Wars of the Roses. By 1375, Edward III had learned the harsh lesson that military conquest, however spectacular, could not create lasting political solutions without addressing the underlying sources of conflict and instability. The king, who had achieved such remarkable success through tactical innovation and strategic boldness, found himself unable to adapt these methods to the changed circumstances of his later years, resulting in the systematic erosion of his earlier achievements. The final decade of Edward III's reign presents a melancholy contrast to the glorious achievements that had marked his earlier years, as the once mighty warrior king succumbed to the combined effects of advancing age, personal loss, and the corrupting influence of unworthy favourites. The transformation of Edward from the vigorous champion of English arms into a feeble monarch, dominated by grasping courtiers, represents one of the most tragic declines in the annals of medieval kingship, serving as a stark reminder of the fragility of human greatness and the inevitable passage of time. The death of Queen Philippa in August 1369 marked the beginning of Edward's personal and political decline, removing from his life the stabilizing influence of a woman whose intelligence, dignity, and moral authority had helped sustain the king through nearly 4 decades of marriage and kingship. Philippa's death coincided ominously with the renewal of French warfare, as if the loss of his beloved queen had weakened Edward's capacity to deal with the mounting challenges that would define his final years. Contemporary accounts describe Edward's grief at Philippa's death as profound and lasting, suggesting that the king never fully recovered from the loss of the woman who had been his closest advisor and most trusted companion. The couple's relationship had been one of the happiest royal marriages of the medieval period, marked by genuine affection, mutual respect, and shared commitment to the duties of kingship. Philippa's absence left a void in Edward's personal life that would be filled by individuals far less worthy of royal confidence. The emergence of Alice Perrers as Edward's mistress represented more than mere royal infidelity. It symbolized the corruption of judgment and the abandonment of standards that had characterized the king's earlier reign. Alice, a woman of obscure origins who had served in Philippa's household, possessed neither the noble birth nor the moral character appropriate for such intimate association with royal authority. Her influence over the aging king would become a source of scandal that damaged royal prestige while contributing to the political crises that marked Edward's final years. Alice Perrers' rise to power demonstrated both Edward's increasing vulnerability to manipulation and the opportunism of courtiers who sought to profit from royal weakness. Unlike the great nobles and experienced administrators who had advised Edward during his years of success, Alice represented the triumph of personal ambition over public service. Her accumulation of lands, titles, and wealth at the expense of the crown created resentment among the traditional nobility, while undermining confidence in royal judgment. The extent of Alice's influence over Edward became apparent through her interference in legal proceedings, her manipulation of royal appointments, and her acquisition of properties that should have remained in crown hands. Contemporary chroniclers described her as sitting beside the king in court, wearing royal jewels, and exercising authority that properly belonged to the queen or other members of the royal family. Such behavior violated every convention of medieval monarchy, while demonstrating the complete breakdown of proper courtly order. The financial cost of Edward's relationship with Alice Perrers proved as damaging as its political consequences, as the king showered his mistress with gifts and grants that depleted royal resources, while providing no corresponding benefit to the kingdom. The lands and revenues granted to Alice represented a significant drain on crown finances at a time when England faced mounting military expenses and declining income from continental possessions. Edward's physical and mental decline during the 1370s became increasingly apparent to observers who remembered the vigorous warrior king of earlier decades. Contemporary accounts describe a monarch who appeared aged beyond his years, suffering from what may have been a series of minor strokes that affected his memory, judgment, and energy. The king's increasing absence from government business and his apparent lack of interest in affairs that had once consumed his attention created opportunities for manipulation by those who surrounded him. The political vacuum created by Edward's declining capacity was filled by a combination of royal relatives, ambitious courtiers, and administrative officials whose competence varied considerably. John of Gaunt, the king's fourth son, emerged as the most powerful figure in English politics, using his position as Lancaster's heir and his father's declining influence to advance his own considerable ambitions. Yet Gaunt's political judgment proved far inferior to his military capabilities, and his policies often generated more opposition than support. The administrative corruption that flourished during Edward's declining years reflected both the absence of effective royal supervision and the opportunities created by an increasingly complex governmental system. Officials who had served competently under strong royal leadership began to prioritize personal enrichment over public service, creating scandals that undermined confidence in royal government while reducing administrative efficiency. The contrast between Edward's court during his years of glory and its condition during his decline could not have been more stark, where, once the greatest nobles of Europe had gathered to witness displays of English martial prowess and cultural achievement, the court of the 1370s became known for its corruption, favoritism, and the unseemly influence of unworthy individuals. The transformation reflected not only the king's personal failings, but also the broader changes that were affecting medieval monarchy throughout Europe. The military disasters that accompanied Edward's personal decline contributed to and were exacerbated by the corruption and inefficiency that characterized his government during this period. The loss of continental territories resulted partly from poor strategic decisions made by advisors who lacked the experience and judgment of their predecessors, while the failure to maintain adequate military forces reflected both financial constraints and administrative incompetence. The domestic opposition that emerged during the 1370s represented more than routine political criticism. It reflected genuine concern about the direction of royal policy and the fitness of those who were making crucial decisions. Parliamentary critics focused particularly on the influence of Alice Perrers and other corrupt favourites, demanding their removal and the restoration of proper governmental procedures. The economic impact of governmental corruption proved as damaging as its political consequences, as royal resources were diverted from legitimate purposes to support the extravagant lifestyle of Alice Perrers and other royal favourites. The kingdom's financial position, already weakened by military expenses and territorial losses, deteriorated further as crown revenues were misappropriated and administrative efficiency declined. Edward's relationship with his nobles during this period reflected both his continued need for their support and their growing dissatisfaction with his leadership. Many of the great families that had supported the king during his years of triumph found themselves excluded from influence, while less worthy individuals gained access to royal favour. This alienation of traditional supporters created political instability while weakening the foundations of royal authority. The cultural and intellectual decline that accompanied Edward's political failures represented another dimension of the comprehensive deterioration that characterized his final years. The court, that had once been a center of chivalric achievement and artistic patronage, became associated with corruption and mediocrity, losing the prestige that had made it a model for European nobility. The diplomatic consequences of England's domestic troubles proved as serious as their internal effects, as foreign observers noted the kingdom's declining effectiveness and adjusted their policies accordingly. The reputation for competence and reliability that had made England an attractive ally during Edward's prime gave way to perceptions of weakness and instability that isolated the kingdom diplomatically. The religious dimension of Edward's decline manifested itself through his apparent abandonment of the pious practices that had characterized his earlier years. The king's scandalous relationship with Alice Perrers violated the moral standards expected of Christian monarchs, while his neglect of traditional religious observances suggested a broader deterioration in his character and judgment. The legal innovations and administrative reforms that had marked Edward's earlier reign gave way to arbitrary decision-making and the manipulation of justice for personal and political purposes. The corruption of legal procedures to benefit Alice Perrers and other favourites undermined confidence in royal justice, while creating precedents that would influence English legal development in unfortunate ways. The military organisation that had brought England such spectacular success began to deteriorate as resources were diverted to support court corruption, while experienced commanders were replaced by individuals whose primary qualifications were political rather than military. The decline in English military effectiveness contributed to the territorial losses that characterized this period, while reducing the kingdom's capacity for future recovery. Edward's treatment of his family during this period reflected both his personal weakness and the political pressures that surrounded him. The king's obvious favoritism toward Alice Perrers created tensions within the royal family, while his failure to prepare adequately for the succession contributed to the political instability that would characterize the reign of his successor. The parliamentary criticism that reached its climax in the Good Parliament of 1376 represented the culmination of years of growing dissatisfaction with Edward's leadership and the influence of his corrupt favourites. The impeachment proceedings launched against royal officials marked a constitutional innovation that would influence English political development for centuries, while the attack on Alice Perrers demonstrated the extent of public revulsion at her continued influence over the aging king. By 1375, Edward III had become a tragic figure whose personal decline mirrored and contributed to the broader deterioration of English power and prestige. The king, who had once been the terror of his enemies and the pride of his subjects, had been reduced to a feeble old man, dominated by unworthy favourites and incapable of the decisive leadership that had once made him the most formidable monarch in Europe. The gathering political storm that had been building throughout Edward III's declining years finally broke with devastating force in the spring of 1376, when what became known as the Good Parliament assembled at Westminster to confront the corruption and misgovernment that had characterized the final phase of the king's reign. This extraordinary assembly marked both the culmination of decades of constitutional development under Edward's rule and a decisive moment in the evolution of English parliamentary government that would influence the kingdom's political development for centuries to come. The circumstances that led to the convening of this momentous parliament reflected the convergence of multiple crises that had overwhelmed Edward's capacity for effective leadership: the military disasters in France, the financial chaos created by years of expensive warfare and domestic corruption, and the growing unpopularity of the king's favourites had created a perfect storm of political opposition that could no longer be contained through traditional methods of royal management. The composition of the Good Parliament differed significantly from the compliant assemblies that had generally supported Edward's policies during his years of success. The Commons in particular included a substantial number of knights and burgesses who had grown increasingly frustrated with the mismanagement of royal affairs and were determined to demand accountability from those responsible for the kingdom's difficulties. Their willingness to challenge royal authority directly represented a fundamental shift in parliamentary attitudes that reflected broader changes in English political culture. Sir Peter de la Mare, who emerged as the first official Speaker of the House of Commons during this Parliament, embodied the new assertiveness that characterized this assembly. His election to this unprecedented position demonstrated the Commons' determination to coordinate their opposition to royal policies while presenting a united front against the king's supporters. The creation of the speakership represented a constitutional innovation that would prove to be one of the Good Parliament's most enduring legacies. The charges brought against royal officials during the Good Parliament read like a comprehensive indictment of the corruption and incompetence that had characterized Edward's government during his declining years. Lord Chamberlain William Latimer and Steward of the Household John Neville were accused of embezzling royal revenues while manipulating government contracts for personal profit. These accusations reflected broader patterns of administrative abuse that had undermined royal authority while enriching unworthy favourites at the public expense. The attack on Alice Perrers represented the most dramatic and symbolically significant aspect of the Good Parliament's proceedings, as the Commons demanded the removal of the King's mistress and the recovery of the lands and revenues she had acquired through royal favour. The unprecedented nature of parliamentary interference in the King's personal relationships demonstrated both the extent of public outrage at Alice's influence and the Commons' growing confidence in their right to hold royal advisers accountable for their actions. The impeachment proceedings conducted during the Good Parliament marked a crucial constitutional innovation that provided a legal mechanism for parliamentary prosecution of royal officials accused of misconduct. This procedure, which combined elements of traditional accusation with new forms of parliamentary trial, created precedents that would influence English constitutional development for centuries while establishing the principle that even high royal officials were subject to parliamentary oversight. Edward III's response to the Good Parliament's challenges revealed both his continued political instincts and the limitations imposed by his physical decline. The aged king's apparent acquiescence to parliamentary demands may have reflected genuine recognition of the validity of their complaints, or it may have simply demonstrated his lack of energy for sustained political conflict. In either case, his failure to defend his favourites effectively marked a significant departure from the vigorous leadership that had characterised his earlier reign. The death of Edward the Black Prince on June 8, 1376, during the Good Parliament's proceedings, removed from English politics the one figure who might have provided effective leadership during this critical period. The prince's death not only eliminated a potential rival to John of Gaunt's growing influence, but also created a succession crisis that would complicate English politics for generations to come. The loss of the heir apparent during such a crucial moment demonstrated the fragility of royal authority and the unpredictable nature of dynastic politics. John of Gaunt's response to his brother's death and the Good Parliament's challenges revealed both his political ambitions and his tactical limitations. The Duke's attempts to protect royal prerogatives while advancing his own interests created suspicions about his ultimate intentions that would plague his political career for decades. His obvious frustration with parliamentary criticism demonstrated his lack of the diplomatic skills that had enabled his father to manage noble and parliamentary opposition during his prime. The Commons' attack on the government's conduct of the French War reflected both their frustration with military failure and their growing skepticism about the wisdom of continuing to pursue continental ambitions that appeared increasingly unrealistic. Parliamentary criticism focused particularly on the enormous costs of maintaining English possessions in France while achieving minimal strategic benefit, suggesting that domestic opinion was beginning to turn against the foreign policy that had defined Edward's reign. The financial reforms demanded by the Good Parliament addressed fundamental problems in royal administration that had contributed to both the kingdom's fiscal difficulties and the opportunities for corruption that had flourished under weak royal supervision. Parliamentary proposals for improved accounting procedures and greater oversight of royal expenditures reflected sophisticated understanding of governmental finance while demonstrating the Commons' determination to prevent future abuses. The religious dimension of the Good Parliament's proceedings manifested itself through criticism of clerical involvement in secular administration and demands for reform of ecclesiastical abuse. Parliamentary attacks on corrupt clergy reflected broader currents of religious reform that were beginning to influence English society, while demonstrating the Commons' willingness to challenge traditional authorities when they appeared to be failing in their duties. The constitutional significance of the Good Parliament extended far beyond its immediate political impact to encompass fundamental changes in the relationship between royal authority and parliamentary power. The precedents established during these proceedings created new expectations about parliamentary rights and responsibilities that would influence English political development long after the specific issues that had triggered the crisis were resolved. Edward's physical condition during the Good Parliament's proceedings became increasingly apparent to observers who noted his obvious frailty and apparent disorientation during formal ceremonies. Contemporary accounts describe a monarch who appeared to be aging rapidly, while losing the mental acuity that had once made him such an effective political leader. The contrast between the vigorous warrior king of earlier decades and the feeble old man who presided over these proceedings must have been particularly striking to those who remembered Edward in his prime. The popular support demonstrated for the Good Parliament's reforms reflected widespread dissatisfaction with royal government that extended far beyond the immediate circle of parliamentary critics. Public opinion, as expressed through petitions and other forms of political communication, strongly supported the Commons' attacks on corruption while endorsing their demands for governmental reform. This popular backing provided parliamentary leaders with the political strength necessary to maintain their opposition, despite royal and noble pressure. The international implications of the Good Parliament's proceedings were not lost on foreign observers, who noted the apparent weakness of English royal authority and the kingdom's internal divisions. The spectacle of a once mighty monarch being challenged so directly by his own subjects suggested fundamental changes in English political culture that might influence the European balance of power for years to come. The economic impact of the Good Parliament's reforms, while difficult to measure precisely, appears to have contributed to some improvement in royal financial management and a reduction in the most egregious forms of administrative corruption. Parliamentary pressure for accountability created new constraints on royal officials while establishing procedures for oversight that would influence governmental efficiency long after the specific individuals involved had been removed from office. The cultural significance of the Good Parliament reflected broader changes in English society that were challenging traditional forms of authority while creating new expectations about governmental accountability. The willingness of parliamentary representatives to confront royal power directly suggested the emergence of new political attitudes that would influence English development for centuries, while contributing to the kingdom's distinctive constitutional tradition. The reversal of many of the Good Parliament's achievements during the subsequent Parliament of 1377 demonstrated both the limitations of parliamentary power when confronted with determined royal opposition and the temporary nature of many constitutional innovations during this period. John of Gaunt's success in undoing much of the Good Parliament's work revealed the continued importance of royal favour and noble support in medieval political culture, while highlighting the challenges faced by those seeking to implement lasting governmental reform. Edward III's final months, from the dissolution of the Good Parliament in July 1376 to his death in June 1377, were characterized by increasing physical weakness and apparent withdrawal from active participation in government. Contemporary accounts describe a monarch who spent most of his time at Windsor Castle or other favourite residences, attended by a small circle of servants and favourites, while showing little interest in the affairs of state that had once consumed his attention. The king's last public appearances revealed the extent of his physical deterioration, while demonstrating his continued attachment to the ceremonial aspects of monarchy that had always been important to him. His participation in the Garter ceremonies at Windsor Castle in April 1377, though clearly difficult for him, showed his determination to maintain the chivalric traditions that had been one of his greatest contributions to English royal culture. The final crisis of Edward's reign came in the form of a severe illness that struck him in late May 1377, apparently beginning with an abscess that developed into a more serious condition affecting his overall health. Contemporary medical knowledge was insufficient to provide effective treatment for whatever ailment had afflicted the king, and it became increasingly apparent that his long reign was drawing to its close. Edward III died at Sheen Palace on June 21st, 1377, surrounded by a small group of courtiers and clerics who had remained faithful despite the scandals and controversies that had marked his final years. The king's death was not unexpected, given his obvious physical decline, yet it marked the end of an era in English history and the beginning of a new phase of political uncertainty that would challenge the kingdom's stability for generations to come. The immediate aftermath of Edward's death revealed both the institutional strength that he had created during his long reign and the political weaknesses that had developed during his declining years. The smooth transfer of power to his 10-year-old grandson, Richard II, demonstrated the effectiveness of established succession procedures, yet the new king's minority government would face challenges that reflected unresolved problems from Edward's final years. The death of Edward III on that quiet summer day in 1377 marked not an ending, but a transformation, as the king's earthly struggles gave way to a historical legacy that would shape English identity and European politics for centuries to come. The man who had breathed his last at Sheen Palace left behind a kingdom fundamentally altered by 5 decades of his rule. A continental war would persist long after his passing, and innovations in government, law, and military affairs that would influence civilization itself. Edward's immediate successor, the 10-year-old Richard II, inherited both the glory and the burden of his grandfather's achievements. The boy king ascended to a throne that commanded unprecedented prestige throughout Europe, yet he also faced challenges that would have tested the most experienced monarch. The 100 Years' War that Edward had initiated showed no signs of resolution, while the domestic problems that had plagued the king's final years remained largely unaddressed. The Regency government that assumed power during Richard II's minority struggled to maintain the military momentum that had brought England such spectacular success under Edward's personal leadership. The loss of the Black Prince's tactical genius, combined with the absence of other experienced commanders from Edward's golden age, created a leadership vacuum that French forces under Charles V were quick to exploit. The systematic recovery of English territories that had begun during Edward's lifetime accelerated under the new regime's weaker direction. The financial legacy of Edward's reign proved particularly problematic for his successors, as the enormous costs of continental warfare had created debt burdens that would constrain English policy for generations. The taxation methods developed to fund Edward's campaigns had pushed royal demands for revenue to levels that generated increasing resistance, while the economic disruption caused by decades of military mobilization had weakened the productive capacity that sustained royal income. The constitutional precedents established during Edward's reign, particularly through the crisis of the Good Parliament, created new expectations about the relationship between royal authority and parliamentary power that would influence English political development for centuries. The impeachment procedures developed in 1376 provided future parliaments with powerful weapons for controlling royal government, while the principle of parliamentary consent to taxation became so firmly established that even the most autocratic monarchs would find it difficult to ignore. The military innovations that had brought Edward such spectacular success became the foundation upon which English tactical doctrine would be built for the remainder of the medieval period and beyond. The combination of longbow archery with disciplined infantry that had proven so devastating at Crécy and Poitiers became the standard approach to battlefield tactics, while the professional military organization that Edward had developed provided models for subsequent military reforms. The cultural impact of Edward's reign extended far beyond England to influence European chivalric ideals and courtly culture throughout the continent. The Order of the Garter became the model for similar institutions in other kingdoms, while the Arthurian revival that Edward had promoted contributed to literary and artistic developments that would flourish for centuries. The English court's reputation for magnificence and military prowess attracted admiration and imitation from aristocrats throughout Europe. The linguistic changes that accelerated during Edward's reign contributed to the emergence of English as a language of serious literary and administrative use, marking a crucial step in the development of English national identity. The replacement of French with English in legal proceedings and official documents reflected broader cultural shifts that would ultimately make England more distinctly separate from continental European norms. Edward's impact on European diplomacy proved equally lasting, as the network of alliances and rivalries that he had created continued to influence international relations long after his death. The principle that dynastic claims could justify military conquest became firmly established in European political culture, creating precedents that would be invoked by ambitious monarchs for centuries to come. The demographic and social changes that occurred during Edward's reign, particularly those triggered by the Black Death, fundamentally altered the structure of English society, while creating new political and economic dynamics that would influence the kingdom's development for generations. The breakdown of traditional feudal relationships and the emergence of new forms of social organization reflected broader transformations that Edward's policies had both encouraged and attempted to control. The economic consequences of Edward's military policies proved particularly significant for England's long-term development, as the emphasis on wool production and textile manufacturing that had funded his campaigns contributed to fundamental changes in the kingdom's economic structure. The commercial relationships established during his reign provided foundations for England's eventual emergence as a major trading nation. The religious implications of Edward's reign were equally complex, as his assertion of royal authority over ecclesiastical affairs contributed to broader tensions between secular and religious power that would influence English religious development for centuries. The statutes of Provisors and Praemunire established precedents for royal control over church appointments and revenues that would prove crucial during the later Protestant Reformation. The territorial legacy of Edward's conquests proved more ephemeral than his other achievements, as most of the continental possessions secured through military victory were gradually lost during the reigns of his successors. Yet even this apparent failure contributed to significant historical developments, as the loss of continental territories forced England to develop new approaches to international relations while contributing to the emergence of distinctly English forms of political and cultural identity. The historiographical impact of Edward's reign created narratives and interpretations that would influence English national consciousness for centuries. The stories of military triumph at Crécy and Poitiers became foundational myths that helped shape English attitudes toward warfare and national identity, while the king's personal reputation as the perfect chivalric monarch provided models for subsequent rulers to emulate or reject. The technological innovations that flourished during Edward's reign, particularly in military affairs, contributed to broader transformations in European warfare that would ultimately make medieval forms of combat obsolete. The development of improved artillery and the refinement of siege techniques created new strategic possibilities, while making traditional fortifications increasingly vulnerable. The administrative achievements of Edward's government provided models for bureaucratic efficiency that would influence governmental development throughout Europe. The sophisticated financial and legal procedures developed during his reign demonstrated the possibilities for systematic administration while creating expectations about governmental competence that would challenge subsequent monarchs. The artistic and architectural legacy of Edward's reign, exemplified by the reconstruction of Windsor Castle and the establishment of St. George's Chapel, created physical monuments that would inspire and influence cultural development for centuries. The synthesis of military, religious, and courtly themes achieved in these projects provided models for royal patronage, while demonstrating the possibilities for combining aesthetic achievement with political purposes. The educational and intellectual developments that occurred during Edward's reign contributed to broader transformations in European learning and culture that would influence the Renaissance and subsequent intellectual movements. The patronage of scholars and the support for educational institutions helped create foundations for intellectual advancement, while demonstrating royal commitment to learning and cultural development. The legal innovations implemented during Edward's reign established precedents that would influence English jurisprudence for centuries, while contributing to the development of common law traditions that would eventually spread throughout the English-speaking world. The expansion of royal justice and the refinement of legal procedures created more efficient mechanisms for resolving disputes, while providing models for subsequent legal reform. The medical and scientific knowledge that developed during Edward's reign, though limited by medieval understanding, contributed to gradual improvements in healthcare and natural philosophy that would influence subsequent intellectual development. The royal court's patronage of learning helped support scholarly activities, while creating environments where new knowledge could develop and flourish. The agricultural and environmental changes that occurred during Edward's reign reflected broader transformations in medieval society, while contributing to long-term changes in land use and rural organization. The demographic impact of the Black Death, combined with the economic pressures created by military finance to produce fundamental alterations in agricultural practices and rural social relationships. The urban development that characterized Edward's reign contributed to the emergence of new forms of commercial and cultural life, while creating foundations for England's eventual transformation into a predominantly urban society. The growth of towns and cities reflected broader economic changes, while creating new opportunities for social mobility and cultural innovation. Edward III's reign had lasted 50 years and encompassed some of the most dramatic transformations in medieval European history. The kingdom he left to his successors bore little resemblance to the realm he had inherited from his troubled father, while the continent-wide war he had initiated would continue to shape European development long after his passing. The warrior king, who had restored English military prestige through victories at Crécy and Poitiers, had also created new forms of parliamentary government, established lasting cultural institutions, and contributed to fundamental changes in European political culture. Yet perhaps his most significant legacy was the demonstration that individual leadership could indeed alter the course of history, for better or worse, through the application of intelligence, determination, and strategic vision. The century of war that Edward III had begun would ultimately consume both England and France in conflicts that would last until the middle of the 15th century, creating devastation and suffering on a scale that few could have imagined when young Edward first assumed the French royal title in 1340. The pursuit of dynastic ambition that had seemed so reasonable and achievable in the aftermath of Crécy would prove to be a form of historical hubris that would test both kingdoms to their very limits. Yet from this great conflict would emerge new forms of national consciousness, new approaches to government and warfare, and new cultural achievements that would enrich European civilization for centuries to come. Edward III's legacy was thus paradoxical. A reign of unprecedented military success that created precedents for centuries of warfare, governmental innovations that strengthened royal authority while empowering parliamentary opposition, and cultural achievements that celebrated martial glory while contributing to the eventual obsolescence of chivalric ideals. The sleep that claimed Edward III on that June evening in 1377 was the rest of a man who had lived one of the most eventful and consequential lives in medieval history. The boy who had been born into political chaos at Windsor Castle in 1312 had become the man who fundamentally altered the trajectory of English and European development through 5 decades of vigorous and innovative leadership. As we close this long tale of Edward III's remarkable life, we leave him not in the weakness and corruption of his final years, but in the full glory of his prime. The warrior king who had made England feared throughout Europe, who had created new institutions that would outlast his continental conquests, and who had demonstrated that medieval monarchy could indeed adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining the ceremonial magnificence that made kingship a source of wonder and inspiration for generations of subjects. The sleep that comes to all monarchs had finally claimed Edward III, but the consequences of his remarkable reign would continue to unfold for centuries, making him truly one of those historical figures whose influence extends far beyond their own lifetime into the broader currents of human development and achievement. And so ends the tale of Edward III of England, the warrior king who started a century of war, restored English honor after his father's humiliations, created lasting innovations in government and law, and demonstrated both the glorious possibilities and the tragic limitations of medieval kingship. May his story carry you gently into peaceful sleep, as the echoes of his great deeds fade into the quiet of dreams and the soft embrace of night.